Hey guys, tonight, we begin with a journey into the quiet and often overlooked corners of history. A history not of kings or knights, not of battles or castles, but of women, forgotten, hidden, and left in the margins of medieval chronicles. These were women who lived in shadows, whose stories were rarely written, yet whose hands carried the weight of fields, homes, children, and faith. Their lives, though unrecorded, shaped the world as surely as the banners of war or the crowns of monarchs. So, before you settle in, take a moment to adjust your surroundings. Dim the lights, maybe let a candle flicker softly in the corner, or simply rest back against your pillow as the hum of the night becomes your companion. If you haven't already, tap the like button and subscribe, because this is only the beginning of a long journey through forgotten history. Now, let us set the scene. Imagine the medieval world, cobbled lanes glistening after rain, the sound of distant church bells echoing across fields, and women moving quietly, unseen, yet everywhere. Tonight, we will trace their stories, one by one, from birth to death, from silence to remembrance. And as the hours pass, we will allow their lives to drift through us like a soft current, calm and unhurried. In the medieval world, the moment of birth was both ordinary and monumental, a rhythm that pulsed endlessly through the centuries, shaping the quiet cycles of villages, towns, and noble households alike. The arrival of a child was not met with the exuberant celebrations that modern minds might expect, but rather with a subdued mix of relief, anxiety, and resignation. For mothers, childbirth carried a very real possibility of death, and for infants, survival was never assured. In this uncertain environment, the birth of a daughter was met with feelings that were often muted, shadowed by cultural expectations that valued sons above all else. Yet, within these quiet beginnings, the hidden stories of medieval women were already being written. The first moments of a newborn girl's life were not her own to shape. Before she could cry or open her eyes, her place in the world was already being defined. In noble families, her birth might be noted with the same ink that recorded land transactions and political marriages, a mere footnote in genealogical rolls. Among peasants, her arrival would be whispered within the thatched walls of a cottage, perhaps acknowledged with a weary sigh, as another mouth to feed, another dowry to consider in the distant future. A son could promise labor in the fields or defense in times of war, while a daughter was often regarded through the lens of obligations she might one day carry into marriage. This distinction was not always cruel, but it was unyielding, woven into the fabric of medieval society, like threads in a loom that could not be undone. Religion played a decisive role in shaping how families and communities perceived a female child's birth. The Church framed women's existence through the legacy of Eve, a narrative of weakness and sin that placed them in a position of spiritual vulnerability from the very beginning. Yet, paradoxically, the Church also exalted the Virgin Mary as the ideal of purity, humility, and maternal devotion. A newborn daughter, then, entered into a world of contradictions, expected to embody both frailty and virtue, submission and endurance. Baptism was swift, often within hours or days of birth, for infant mortality was high, and unbaptized souls were feared to be lost. In this way, the first ritual of a baby girl's life was not simply a welcome, but a safeguard, a plea to heaven to claim her in case she did not survive the fragile days ahead. Infant mortality shaped medieval life so profoundly that families often hesitated to grow too attached to their youngest members. Estimates suggest that as many as 1 in 3 infants did not survive past their first year, with daughters faring worse than sons in some regions where resources were scarce. Female infanticide, though difficult to measure, has been suggested by certain scholars, particularly in times of famine, when sons were seen as more useful to the household economy. More often, however, neglect was subtle rather than overt: less food, less medical care, or a dowry that would never be saved. Such realities meant that a daughter's first breath was taken in a world that did not prioritize her survival, yet countless girls endured, quietly shaping the daily labor that sustained families and communities. The material circumstances of birth varied widely depending on status. In peasant cottages, women gave birth in cramped, smoky rooms, often assisted by neighbors or village midwives, who carried knowledge passed through generations of experience. Herbs might be burned, charms whispered, prayers murmured, all in hopes of easing the perilous ordeal. In noble households, births were more structured, attended by servants, midwives, and sometimes physicians, though medical knowledge was limited, and often guided as much by superstition as by science. Even in great halls, childbirth was no less dangerous, and noble women frequently died young, their lives defined by repeated pregnancies in the pursuit of heirs. Whether born in straw or on embroidered linens, a daughter's first experience of the world was one of risk, surrounded by women whose own bodies bore the scars of survival. Names carried symbolic weight, and a daughter's naming could reflect both devotion and expectation. Many bore the names of saints, linking them to models of piety or martyrdom, while others inherited family names, reminders of lineages that were often traced more keenly through male heirs. In rural villages, names might repeat endlessly across generations, blurring the individuality of daughters into a continuum of quiet laborers and mothers. A girl named Mary, Agnes, or Catherine was not expected to chart her own path, but to embody the roles prescribed by the saints whose names she bore: obedience, chastity, or endurance. In this way, even a name reinforced the boundaries of her life. The wider community received the birth of a daughter with little ceremony. In some regions, neighbors might gather briefly, offering blessings or gifts of food, though these were practical gestures as much as celebratory ones. A son might be toasted in alehouses, his arrival marking the promise of future strength for the household, but a daughter's birth passed with quieter acknowledgement. This did not mean that parents felt no affection for their daughters. Rather, affection was tempered by realism, by the awareness that their survival was uncertain, and that their future would be determined less by choice than by custom. The silence surrounding these births was not absence, but a reflection of the subdued rhythms of a society where survival itself demanded practicality over sentiment. Even in these early days, expectations began to form around the infant. A girl might be swaddled tightly, believed to strengthen her limbs and protect her fragile body, but also to instill discipline and quietness. Songs or prayers might be whispered over her, often carrying themes of obedience, humility, and patience, virtues that would later define her expected role as daughter, wife, and mother. The shaping of a woman's identity began not in adolescence, but in the cradle, where the weight of generations pressed upon her small form like an invisible inheritance. And so the life of a medieval woman began in hushed tones, in spaces filled with the mingled scents of herbs, wood smoke, and damp earth, in cottages and chambers where the sound of her first cry was already bound to expectations she could not escape. The silence that surrounded her birth was not merely the absence of celebration, but the echo of a society that did not yet know how to record her story, how to see her labor, her resilience, or her quiet contributions as worthy of chronicle. From the very beginning, she lived in the margins of history, her existence folded into the ordinary fabric of life, where extraordinary strength was demanded yet rarely acknowledged. This was the world into which medieval daughters were born, a world of quiet expectations, high risks and uncertain futures, where their first breath was both fragile and fated. Their forgotten stories began here, in the dim light of birth chambers, in the muted reactions of weary families, in the silence of records that barely noted their existence. It was in these beginnings that the pattern of their lives was set, and from these small fragile starts, the forgotten women of the Middle Ages would endure, shaping history from its hidden edges. Childhood in the Middle Ages was never a prolonged period of innocence, and for girls it was even shorter, defined less by exploration and more by preparation for the roles that society expected them to fulfill. From the moment a daughter survived the fragile days of infancy, her life moved along a narrow path, its boundaries drawn by tradition, necessity, and faith. Her earliest memories would not be of toys or play, but of labor, imitation, and the slow absorption of gender roles that shaped her existence before she could even understand them. The medieval girl's first years unfolded mostly within the household, a space that served as both refuge and training ground. For the peasant child, this might mean a one-room cottage, walls blackened by smoke, with little separation between work and rest. For a girl born into nobility, it might be the chambered halls of a manor or castle, where servants moved quietly, and the scent of wax candles mingled with damp stone. Yet, despite the differences in setting, the essence of her upbringing remained much the same: girls were guided early into the world of domestic responsibility. Where boys might be encouraged to roam fields or assist fathers with ploughing, a daughter's place was beside her mother, observing and imitating the endless cycle of tasks that defined medieval life. Play, where it existed, was practical rather than leisurely. A girl might fashion dolls out of scraps of cloth or bits of wood, but these were less amusements and more reflections of her future role, miniature rehearsals for the children she herself would one day be expected to raise. Games that involved imitation of cooking, weaving, or tending animals blurred seamlessly into the chores that soon became her reality. Unlike the imagined freedom often ascribed to childhood today, medieval girlhood was characterized by its brevity and its integration into the working fabric of the household. Childhood was less a stage of life in itself than a preparation for adulthood. Education, in the formal sense, was limited for most medieval girls. In peasant households, literacy was rare, and knowledge was transmitted orally, through the repetition of prayers, the memorization of simple hymns, or the instructions woven into daily labor. Girls learned how to grind grain, bake bread, spin wool, and mend clothing, often before they were old enough to complete such tasks independently. In noble households, education was somewhat broader, though still shaped by the expectation of marriage and household management. A daughter of wealth might learn to read religious texts, to sing hymns, or to practice basic needlework and music, accomplishments that enhanced her value as a bride. Still, these pursuits rarely extended to the intellectual freedoms reserved for boys, who might study Latin, philosophy, or law. A girl's education, no matter her station, was framed within the limits of what would make her useful within the narrow confines of her future. Religion infused every aspect of childhood. Girls were taught prayers from an early age, guided to kneel before wooden crucifixes or images of saints, to bow their heads when church bells tolled, and to observe the rituals that marked the liturgical year. The stories they absorbed reinforced ideals of obedience, chastity, and humility. Saints' lives, often recited or depicted in art, offered models of female behavior that emphasized self-sacrifice and virtue. A young girl might hear tales of St. Agnes or St. Cecilia, martyrs, who died for their purity, their names whispered as reminders of the virtues she was expected to embody. In this way, religion was not simply a backdrop, but an active force in shaping her understanding of herself and her place in the world. The shaping of gender roles began almost invisibly, through the repetition of small expectations. A girl was praised for quietness, for helping her mother, for showing deference to her elders. She was corrected quickly if she spoke out of turn, laughed too loudly, or displayed too much curiosity. Her brother might be encouraged to climb, to wrestle, or to handle tools, but her steps were measured, her actions constrained. These differences, absorbed without question, became the foundation of a worldview in which women were destined to serve, to obey, and to endure. The shaping was gentle in its constancy, not always harsh, but unrelenting in its message. A girl's value lay not in herself, but in her service to others. As she grew older, the shadow of her future began to take clearer shape. Conversations about dowries or betrothals might begin when she was still only a child. Decisions made by parents or guardians that would define the course of her life before she had any say in the matter. For peasant girls, this often meant early preparation for marriage, sometimes by the age of 12 or 13, though consummation might come later. Noble girls were pawns in larger political games, their childhoods cut short by negotiations that treated them as tokens and alliances. Even before a girl understood the full meaning of marriage, her future was being decided in quiet conversations held beyond her hearing. The terms of her life exchanged like currency. Yet within these shadows, childhood was not entirely devoid of warmth or affection. Mothers often formed close bonds with their daughters, sharing not only the burdens of labor, but also small comforts, stories told by firelight, songs sung while spinning wool, or gentle instruction passed down with patience. Older sisters often served as caretakers, guiding younger girls with a blend of authority and companionship. The communal nature of medieval households meant that a girl grew up surrounded by a web of women, their lives intertwined through shared labor and survival. While history has largely erased their voices, the traces of these relationships linger in the quiet persistence of traditions that were passed from one generation to the next. For noble daughters, childhood sometimes included a period of fosterage, being sent to another household to learn manners, household management, or courtly skills. This practice, common in medieval Europe, removed girls from their natal homes and placed them in environments where they learned both discipline and diplomacy. These experiences, though varied, reinforced the same lessons of subordination, modesty, and service. Even in the halls of power, a girl's life was a preparation for obedience, her individuality shaped by the needs of her family and the expectations of society. By the time a girl reached adolescence, the shadows of her childhood had prepared her for the role she was expected to embrace. The play of dolls became the care of siblings, the practice of sewing became the production of garments, the memorization of prayers became the recitation of duties to husband and household. The boundaries that had been set in her early years narrowed further, until the contours of her life were defined by roles she had been absorbing since birth. Childhood, in this sense, was less a chapter than a transition, a shadowed passageway leading to an adulthood that had already been determined. And so the forgotten stories of medieval women began not with grand events or notable deeds, but with the quiet rhythms of girlhood, shaped by repetition, by expectation, and by silence. These childhoods were not marked by individuality or freedom, but by their function as training grounds for lives of service. In the shadows of cottages and castles, in the echo of prayers and the repetition of chores, the foundations of womanhood were laid, setting the stage for the lives that would follow. As a medieval girl left the shadowed years of childhood and moved toward early womanhood, the shape of her future was increasingly bound not by her own desires, but by the quiet and unyielding arithmetic of dowries. To be born a daughter was to carry, from the very beginning, an economic weight, a calculation that her family could not escape. While a son represented continuity of name, inheritance, and labor, a daughter represented obligation, for she would one day be married out of the household, and her departure would not be free. The dowry was the bridge between families, a sum that tethered a girl's life to the fortunes or misfortunes of her kin, and it was this system of exchange that defined not only her marriage prospects, but the very lens through which she was valued. The concept of the dowry was not unique to medieval Europe, but within the fabric of medieval society it acquired a particular prominence, reinforced by law, religion, and custom. A dowry was not simply a gift, it was a negotiation, a transfer of wealth that accompanied a bride into her husband's household. It might consist of coin, land, livestock, textiles, or household goods, and its size often determined not only the social rank of her husband, but also her standing within the new household she would join. For noble families, dowries were instruments of strategy, tools by which alliances were secured and influence extended. For peasant families, they were burdensome necessities, sums that could plunge a household into debt, or force difficult choices between the futures of sons and daughters. For the daughter herself, the dowry was a paradox. On one hand, it provided opportunity. Without it, marriage could be difficult or impossible, and a life without marriage was often precarious, marked by dependency on family or the church. On the other hand, the dowry was a chain, binding her to arrangements over which she had little control. Fathers and mothers, uncles and guardians, whispered over figures, haggled in private, and settled her fate, long before she might understand the full implications of their decisions. The negotiations were rarely about her character, her interests, or her desires. They were about what she could bring, or what her absence might cost. In this way, her life was measured in coin, in fields, in animals, in goods that passed between households, as if she herself were another form of property. Among the nobility, dowries could be vast, sometimes determining the balance of power between dynasties. A noble woman's hand in marriage might carry with it a castle, a tract of land, or rights over villages and serfs. Chronicles record such unions as grand events, but rarely do they describe the experience of the women themselves, who moved from one household to another as though their bodies and inheritances were inseparable. A daughter might be betrothed before she had even left childhood, her dowry discussed alongside treaties and titles, her identity subsumed into the strategies of men, her voice, if it appeared at all, was muted, her consent assumed rather than sought. For peasant women, the stakes were different, but no less heavy. A modest dowry might consist of a cow, a bed, or simple household tools, the basic goods that allowed a new household to begin. Even these modest provisions, however, could strain a family's resources, particularly in times of famine or hardship. Families with multiple daughters faced difficult decisions, sometimes delaying marriages until dowries could be gathered, sometimes favoring one daughter over another, sometimes sending daughters into convents as an alternative to marriage, where the dowry took the form of offerings to the church. In all these cases, the girl herself remained a silent figure at the center of decisions made on her behalf. The weight of dowries extended beyond the moment of marriage. A woman's dowry often became part of her legal protection, for in many regions, laws stipulated that her dowry could not be wholly absorbed by her husband's family. Should she be widowed, she might reclaim her dowry, or receive a portion of it back as dower rights, a small form of security in a world where widowhood could leave women vulnerable. Yet, this safeguard was fragile, often dependent on the honesty of her husband's kin, the fairness of local courts, or the willingness of male relatives to defend her rights. In theory, the dowry offered protection. In practice, it often disappeared into the household economy, its return uncertain at best. Religious authorities, too, reinforced the significance of dowries. The church encouraged marriage as a sacrament, and dowries were treated as part of the orderly establishment of households under God's will. Preachers warned against excessive greed, but the reality remained that a daughter without a dowry was often a daughter without options. Convents offered one alternative, but entry into monastic life was rarely free. A girl who could not be married off might still require a dowry to wed her to the church. In this way, even spiritual paths were shaped by the economic weight of her family's ability to provide. The emotional experience of this system is difficult to recover, for medieval records rarely capture the inner lives of women. Yet one can imagine the quiet weight of expectation pressing upon girls as they grew older. The hushed conversations between parents, the anxious glances towards sisters whose futures had yet to be decided. A girl might embroider linens for her dowry chest, each stitch a preparation for a life she had not chosen. She might watch as coins or animals were set aside, knowing they were meant not for the household's survival, but for her departure. In these small, silent ways, the burden of the dowry shaped her understanding of herself, not as a person with her own destiny, but as a vessel for the obligations of her family. In rare cases, dowries elevated women, giving them leverage within their marriages, or ensuring their survival in widowhood. Wealthy heiresses could exercise considerable influence, their dowries so vast that they granted their husbands power only through them. But these were exceptions, noted precisely because they were unusual. For most, the dowry was not empowerment but exchange, a transaction that underscored their lack of agency. The paradox remained: without it, they were vulnerable; with it, they were still controlled. And so, the burden of dowries lay across medieval daughters like a shadow, shaping their futures long before they could speak for themselves. It was a system that turned their lives into calculations, their marriages into negotiations, and their identities into extensions of wealth and property. Forgotten though their voices may be, the structure that bound them remains visible in the records of transactions, in the parchment that recorded sums and promises, in the laws that defined women not as individuals but as dependents. The story of medieval women cannot be told without the story of dowries, for it was here, in the quiet arithmetic of coin and cattle, that their lives were most starkly defined. From noble halls to peasant cottages, from parchment contracts to whispered bargains, the dowry shaped the path from childhood into womanhood. And though these women's names are mostly lost, their presence lingers in the margins of the ledgers, in the forgotten burdens that accompanied them into lives of service, obedience, and endurance. For medieval women, marriage was not merely a stage of life, but the central axis upon which their existence revolved, the defining moment toward which their childhood, training, and dowry all pointed. In a world where individual choice was rare, and where social structures pressed heavily upon the lives of women, marriage was destiny. It was not presented as an option, but as an inevitability, the expected path ordained by culture, enforced by religion, and accepted by communities as the natural order of things. To become a wife was to step into a role centuries in the making, solemn and inescapable, framed not as a personal union, but as a binding contract that reached far beyond the individuals involved. The cultural weight of marriage was immense. In the medieval worldview, society itself was structured upon households, and households were structured upon marriages. To remain unmarried was to linger outside the established order, an anomaly that drew suspicion or pity. Marriage was not simply about companionship or love, but about continuity, stability, and the transmission of property and faith. For noble families, it served as the mechanism for alliances, forging bonds between dynasties that might mean the difference between war and peace. For peasants, it meant the pooling of labor and resources, ensuring survival in a world where isolation spelled hardship. Marriage was the foundation upon which both local communities and vast kingdoms depended, and women's lives were expected to conform to its demands. Religious teachings gave marriage a sanctity that reinforced its inevitability. The Church declared marriage to be a sacrament, a holy union blessed by God, indissoluble, except by death. Priests preached that the roles of husband and wife mirrored the divine order, the husband as head of the household, the wife as obedient partner, reflecting Christ and the Church. This theological framing stripped away the possibility of questioning or resisting the institution, embedding it within the spiritual as well as social fabric of medieval life. To marry was not only a duty to one's family, but also an act of obedience to God, and to refuse marriage, except by choosing the convent, was to step outside divine order. For the woman herself, marriage was rarely a matter of choice. Betrothals could be arranged while she was still in childhood, agreements made between families, sealed by dowries and contracts, with her consent assumed rather than sought. In noble households, daughters might be promised to men they had never met, sometimes across great distances, their fates intertwined with political strategies devised in halls where they had no voice. Among peasants, negotiations were less grand but no less binding, decided by families based on land, livestock, or social standing within the village. The bride's wishes, if they were considered at all, held little weight. Her destiny was not her own to determine, but something handed to her, already shaped by others' needs. The ceremony itself, whether in the grandeur of a cathedral, or the modest space before a parish priest, was solemn and deeply symbolic. Vows were exchanged not in the language of love, but in the language of obedience and permanence. A woman pledged fidelity and service, binding herself not only to her husband but to his family, his household, and his lineage. She was expected to leave behind the identity of daughter and assume fully the identity of wife, her existence absorbed into the structure of her husband's world. The very act of marriage was a form of erasure, a transition in which her individuality was subsumed into the collective demands of family, property, and faith. Yet beneath the solemnity of ritual lay the practical realities of a woman's new life. Marriage was a transfer of responsibility. A woman passed from the guardianship of her father to the authority of her husband. In legal terms, she became a dependent, her rights limited, her capacity to act on her own behalf curtailed. In many regions, married women could not hold property independently, sign contracts, or appear in court without their husband's consent. Even her dowry, meant to provide some measure of security, was absorbed into her husband's household, her control over it largely symbolic. To marry was to surrender autonomy, stepping into a role defined by obedience and service. The expectations placed upon a wife were immense. She was to manage the household, bear children, ensure their survival, and embody the virtues of chastity, fidelity, and piety. Her labor was unending, whether in the fields, in the kitchen, or in the management of servants. She was judged not by her happiness, but by her usefulness, by the smooth functioning of the household and the survival of its members. Her personal desires, if she had them, were muted beneath the pressing demands of survival and the constant reinforcement of her subservient role. Marriage was not a partnership of equals, but a structure of hierarchy, with the woman positioned firmly beneath her husband, For noble women, marriage often meant leaving the familiar landscapes of childhood and traveling to distant lands, entering households where she was a stranger. She might be married to a man decades older than herself, expected to produce heirs quickly, to navigate the politics of a court where alliances and rivalries simmered beneath the surface. For peasant women, marriage tied her to a man whose fortunes were as precarious as her own, their survival dependent on harvests, weather, and labor. In both cases, her fate was intertwined with forces beyond her control, her individuality subsumed into the shared burdens of household and community. Love, where it appeared, was a secondary consideration, more often the product of long familiarity than the cause of marriage itself. The romantic ideals celebrated in troubadour songs or courtly poetry bore little resemblance to the realities of most women's lives. Marriage was not a story of passion, but a structure of necessity, a framework into which women were placed, their destinies sealed by family, faith, and law. The notion of personal happiness was a luxury, rarely considered within the rigid confines of medieval society. Yet within these constraints, women carved out spaces of resilience. Some managed households with skill and authority, earning respect within their communities. Others wielded quiet influence, shaping decisions through subtle persuasion, guiding their children, or supporting their husbands in ways that went unrecorded but were essential. Their power was often invisible, hidden within the daily rhythms of marriage, but it was no less real for its absence in the chronicles. Still, the overarching truth remained. Marriage was their destiny, their path marked out long before they could imagine alternatives. Thus, the story of medieval women cannot be separated from the story of marriage, for it was through marriage that their lives were most often defined. It was the moment where childhood ended, where girlhood faded into the shadows, and where the burdens of adulthood began. It was not a choice, but a destiny, solemn and irreversible, a role shaped by culture, sanctified by religion, and enforced by society. And while the details varied across regions, classes, and centuries, the pattern remained consistent. To be a woman in the Middle Ages was to be a wife, her life measured not in her own terms, but in the service she provided to others. For medieval women, motherhood was not simply a possibility, it was an expectation that carried the full weight of family, society, and religion. From the moment a woman entered marriage, her worth was measured largely by her ability to bear children. She was expected to provide heirs for her husband, secure the continuation of family lines, and populate households with the next generation of workers or noble successors. This role was framed as both sacred duty and natural function, reinforced by the teachings of the Church and by the economic structures that depended on constant renewal of life. To be a wife was to be a mother, and to fail in that role was to fall short not only of personal purpose, but also of societal necessity. Yet motherhood in the medieval world was not a gentle experience. Childbirth was one of the most dangerous events a woman could face in her lifetime. The medical knowledge available was limited, rooted in ancient theories of humors and divine will, with little understanding of infection or anatomy. Midwives, often women themselves, relied on experience, herbs and prayers, guiding mothers through labor with hands worn from years of practice, but without the benefit of effective tools or interventions. Even the most skilled midwife could not prevent the frequent tragedies of hemorrhage, obstructed labor, or puerperal fever. For many women, childbirth was as much a brush with death as it was a moment of new life. Mortality rates reflected this harsh reality. Historians estimate that maternal death was common, with some women succumbing in their very first labor, and others after bearing many children. Families might prepare for childbirth with the same solemnity as they did for funerals, calling priests to administer blessings and arranging for last rites should the worst occur. The Church, recognizing the peril, allowed for emergency baptism of infants during labor, performed even by laypeople if necessary, to ensure that a child would not die unbaptized. This mixture of faith and fear surrounded every birth, reminding women that their most essential duty was also their most dangerous. For those who survived childbirth, the cycle rarely paused for long. with limited understanding of reproductive health and few effective means of contraception. Medieval women were often caught in an unending rhythm of pregnancy, labor, and recovery. Nursing provided some natural spacing between births, but not always enough to shield women from the demands of repeated childbearing. A woman might find herself bearing 10 or more children over her lifetime, though not all would survive infancy. Each pregnancy carried risks, and each loss left both physical and emotional scars, though the latter were rarely given space in the stoic fabric of medieval society. The pressure to produce heirs weighed especially heavily on noble women. For them, motherhood was directly tied to the stability of dynasties and the survival of political alliances. To give birth to a son was to secure a lineage, to fulfill the most essential purpose of their marriage. A daughter, though welcomed for the possibility of future alliances through marriage, was not celebrated in the same way. Women carried the burden of these expectations quietly, knowing that their value in the eyes of their husbands and their families rose or fell with the health and sex of their children. Failure to produce an heir could result in neglect, estrangement, or even annulment of a marriage. For peasant women, motherhood carried different but equally heavy demands. Their children were vital to the survival of the household, providing labor for the fields, herding animals, or assisting in crafts. Infant mortality was high, with diseases, malnutrition, and accidents claiming many young lives, yet families relied on children to contribute from an early age. A peasant mother not only bore children but also nurtured them within the harsh realities of rural life, balancing endless domestic tasks with the constant supervision of young lives that might be cut short at any moment. The grief of losing children was common, woven into the rhythms of life, endured in silence or expressed through rituals of faith. Religious framing reinforced the burdens of motherhood, while offering some measure of comfort. The Virgin Mary was held up as the ultimate model of motherhood, her purity and obedience providing a spiritual archetype for women to emulate. Mothers were taught that their suffering was part of God's design, their endurance a form of piety, their sacrifice mirrored in the holy figures of the Church. While such teachings could provide solace, they also reinforced the inevitability of women's roles, discouraging questions about fairness or autonomy. To be a mother was to walk a path sanctified by faith, even when that path led to exhaustion or death. The physical experience of motherhood left lasting marks on women's bodies. Chronic pain, weakness, and permanent injuries from childbirth were not uncommon, yet little medical support existed to address these conditions. A woman who survived repeated labors often bore the evidence of her endurance, her health worn down by years of service to family and household, and yet her identity was tied so tightly to motherhood that even these costs were expected, endured without complaint, framed as the natural outcome of a woman's duty. Still, within this cycle, moments of quiet intimacy existed. Mothers sang lullabies, passed down from generations, soft tunes that comforted infants in the flickering light of hearth fires. They whispered prayers over sleeping children, watched over them in fields or villages, and guided them through the first lessons of survival. These small unrecorded acts formed the true fabric of motherhood, invisible to chroniclers and scribes, but essential to the continuity of life in the medieval world. The warmth of a mother's embrace, the careful mending of garments, the preparation of food, all carried the quiet weight of love, even when unacknowledged by the wider structures of society. Thus, motherhood in the Middle Ages was a paradox. It was both exalted and dangerous, celebrated as a divine calling, and feared as a deadly trial. Women bore children not out of personal choice, but because society demanded it. And yet, within this demand, they found ways to create bonds of tenderness and resilience. Their lives were defined by an endless cycle of birth and loss, of duty and devotion, carried out in the shadows of faith and necessity. To be a mother was to exist at the very heart of medieval life, both indispensable and overlooked, central to survival, yet rarely honored in chronicles of kings and wars. And so, as the story of medieval women unfolds, it is impossible to separate their identity from the roles they played as mothers. They were bearers of heirs, sustainers of households, and sufferers of the pains that came with both. Their motherhood was their destiny as much as their marriages had been, a path laid before them by the structures of society, and sanctified by the words of the Church. and though many of their names and stories have been lost to time, the echoes of their labor remain, etched into the very survival of medieval communities, their sacrifices forming the invisible foundation upon which history was built. The life of a medieval woman, whether peasant, artisan, or noble, was marked by labor that stretched unbroken across the hours of the day, labor that was both expected and invisible, essential yet rarely acknowledged in records or chronicles. Her hands carried the weight of survival, yet her name seldom found its way into the parchment of history. From the first glimmers of dawn until the quiet descent of night, women worked in fields, kitchens and workshops, their efforts forming the hidden scaffolding upon which the medieval world stood. Without their toil, households would falter, communities would weaken, and the fragile fabric of survival would unravel. Yet their labor passed uncelebrated, absorbed into the rhythms of daily necessity. In rural villages, where the majority of medieval women lived, work began with the land itself. Women joined men in the fields, their labor indistinguishable from that of their husbands, fathers and brothers. They planted and weeded, gathered sheaves during harvest, gleaned the remaining grains after reaping, and carried baskets of produce across uneven ground. The work was physically demanding, bending bodies and straining muscles, yet it was considered part of a woman's duty, expected and unremarkable. The rhythm of agricultural life did not allow for idleness, and women moved seamlessly between field work and domestic labor, their time never truly their own. Beyond the fields, women's labor extended into the essential processes that sustained village life. At the mill, women carried heavy sacks of grain, waiting long hours for flour, their presence unrecorded, except in manorial accounts that listed tolls and fees. At the loom, women wove fabric for clothing, blankets and sails, their skill transforming raw fibers into the materials upon which survival depended. Spinning too was endless, performed with distaff and spindle, hands twisting thread in repetitive motions that filled every spare moment, whether by the hearth, in the courtyard, or during communal gatherings. Spinning was so deeply associated with women that the term distaff side became synonymous with female lineage, a quiet acknowledgement of the centrality of this labor to family life. Kitchens were another arena of women's unrecognized toil. In peasant households, cooking was simple but labor-intensive, requiring the grinding of grains, the tending of hearth fires, the preparation of stews that might stretch limited ingredients into sustenance for entire families. Noble households demanded far greater complexity, with noble women supervising servants, overseeing storerooms, and ensuring the steady production of meals for dozens or even hundreds of mouths. The tasks were unending: salting and preserving meat, brewing ale, baking bread in communal ovens, and managing supplies to last through harsh winters. Each act was a form of labor upon which survival depended, yet none of it was considered worthy of chronicler's ink. Even the care of children, often dismissed as natural rather than laborious, consumed immense time and energy. Mothers nursed, cleaned, taught, and supervised, guiding children not only through infancy, but into early participation in household and agricultural tasks. Young daughters learned spinning and weaving at their mothers' sides, while sons absorbed lessons in farming or crafts. Women's labor extended into this sphere of education, shaping the skills of future generations, though once again their role went unacknowledged in historical narratives that celebrated the achievements of men. In towns and cities, women's labor took on different forms but remained equally invisible. Many women worked within guild structures, assisting husbands in crafts such as brewing, baking, or cloth making. They managed shops, kept accounts, and produced goods, though official guild membership often excluded them, leaving their contributions unrecorded. While widows occasionally stepped into official roles, recognized for their skill and experience, yet even then their work was often described in terms of filling gaps rather than shaping industries. The labor of women sustained urban economies just as it sustained rural households, but it slipped through the cracks of formal recognition, overshadowed by male counterparts. Religious life too depended on women's labor. Convents, though spiritual institutions, were also centers of economic productivity, with nuns engaging in gardening, manuscript copying, textile production, and the management of estates. Their work provided income for their communities, supported charitable efforts, and maintained the rhythm of liturgical life. Yet the contributions of nuns were described less in terms of labor and more in terms of devotion, their economic productivity hidden beneath layers of spiritual interpretation. Even here, where women held more autonomy than most, their toil was framed as service rather than achievement. The invisibility of women's labor was reinforced by the records of the time. Manorial accounts, court rolls and chronicles focused on land, wars and politics, subjects dominated by men. Women's work was rarely noted unless it intersected with taxation or legal disputes. The very survival of medieval society depended upon their efforts, yet official documents rendered them almost invisible, creating a distorted picture of a world sustained largely by male action. The truth lay in the silences, in the unrecorded hours spent weaving, the unmentioned hands stirring stews, the unnamed figures bent over fields. This invisibility did not mean women lacked value in their communities. Villagers, neighbors, and families knew the importance of their labor, even if it was not formally recognized. The success of harvests, the comfort of households, the survival of children, all bore the imprint of women's work. Songs, proverbs, and folklore occasionally captured glimpses of this recognition, hinting at the quiet respect accorded to women who labored tirelessly. Yet these acknowledgements were fleeting, overshadowed by broader cultural frameworks that defined women's worth primarily through marriage and motherhood, rather than through their unceasing toil. The consequences of this invisibility extended beyond the Middle Ages. Historians reliant on the records of the time long overlooked the economic and social importance of women's work, perpetuating narratives that marginalized their contributions. Only in recent decades have scholars begun to piece together the scope of women's labor, reconstructing the hidden economies that sustained medieval life. Archaeological evidence of tools, textile fragments, and household artifacts offers new insights into the central role women played, gradually restoring their presence to a history that had nearly forgotten them. Thus, the labor of medieval women remains both essential and overlooked, a paradox woven into the very fabric of history. They carried water, ground grain, spun thread, wove cloth, brewed ale, tended fields, raised children, and managed households, performing tasks without which survival would have been impossible. Yet they did so without expectation of recognition, their efforts absorbed into the rhythms of daily life, their names absent from chronicles, their stories scattered in fragments. To understand the medieval world fully is to recognize this unseen labor, to acknowledge the countless hands that worked tirelessly beyond recognition, shaping a society that seldom paused to write their names. The medieval world was not a uniform landscape, but a patchwork of manors, villages, towns, and castles, each carrying its own rhythms of life and structures of labor. Women lived within these varied environments, their roles shaped by class, wealth, and circumstance. Yet across these differences, a shared burden of expectation tied them together. Whether noblewoman or peasant, the life of a woman in the Middle Ages was defined by work, duty, and constraint, carried out in spaces that were at once separate and interconnected. The manor and the village formed the two poles of this experience, contrasting worlds that revealed both disparity and similarity in the existence of women. For noble women, life was centered upon the manor, the estate that served as the nucleus of medieval aristocratic life. A manor was both home and administrative hub, where land, tenants, and labor were organized to sustain the wealth and status of the lordly household. Noble women were expected to manage these estates in their husband's absence, a responsibility that demanded competence in overseeing agriculture, rents, and household staff. Records show women issuing instructions to reeves, supervising harvests, and keeping accounts, their presence crucial in ensuring that the manor functioned smoothly. While these tasks gave them a measure of authority, it was authority always framed within the bounds of service to the family and the estate. They were not independent rulers but custodians, holding power only as extensions of their husband's or father's authority. Daily life for noble women also revolved around the management of the household itself. A manor was a complex space, with kitchens, storerooms, stables, and chambers, all requiring oversight. Noble women ensured that servants performed their duties, that food was stored and prepared correctly, that clothing was produced and mended, and that supplies were managed with foresight to carry households through lean months. Their roles required organizational skill and constant vigilance, though the credit for success was rarely theirs. Chronicles spoke of lords who ruled estates, but behind these figures stood women whose labor of supervision and management made such rule possible. Yet noble women were not confined solely to administration. Their lives also bore the burdens of representation and hospitality. A manor was a social center, where guests were received, feasts prepared, and networks of loyalty reinforced through gatherings. Noble women oversaw these rituals, ensuring that hospitality was maintained in ways that reflected the family's status. Their duties included supervising kitchens during banquets, arranging the seating of guests according to rank, and providing clothing or gifts that symbolized generosity. In these moments, noble women embodied the household's honor, their work inseparable from the maintenance of reputation and alliance. Despite these responsibilities, noble women's lives were often circumscribed by the expectations of gender. Their education, though broader than that of peasant women, was still directed towards service literacy sufficient for estate accounts or correspondence, knowledge of medicine for household remedies, skill in embroidery and weaving for clothing and furnishings. Few noble women wielded open political influence, though some, particularly widows or regents, exercised authority in extraordinary circumstances. Still, their agency was defined by the structures of manorial life, bound to the estate and the family it supported. In stark contrast, the majority of medieval women lived not in manors but in villages, where the rhythms of peasant life dictated their existence. For peasant women, survival was bound to the land, their labor intertwined with the cycles of planting, tending, and harvest. They rose at dawn to milk animals, prepare food, and join men in the fields, their bodies bent over the same soil that carried the fate of the entire community. Their work was relentless, unbroken by seasons, for in winter they mended clothing, spun wool, and prepared for the coming year, ensuring that the fragile balance of survival was maintained. The burdens of peasant women were intensified by poverty and limited resources. Where noble women supervised servants, peasant women performed tasks themselves, moving seamlessly between children rearing, cooking, fieldwork, and household maintenance. Water had to be drawn from wells, firewood gathered from forests, bread baked in communal ovens, and clothing patched until it could no longer hold together. Their work was physical and exhausting, yet it was not regarded as exceptional but as natural, the expected role of women in sustaining households. Unlike noble women, who might leave written records or appear in estate accounts, peasant women's lives slipped almost entirely into silence, preserved only in fragments of manorial rolls that recorded fines or taxes. And yet, across these disparities of wealth and circumstance, noble and peasant women shared common burdens. Both bore the expectation of motherhood, with its dangers and demands. Both carried the weight of household management, though in different forms. Both endured the absence of recognition, their work essential but unrecorded, overshadowed by the lives of men who wielded formal authority. Whether in the lofty halls of a manor, or the cramped spaces of a village hut, women's labor was framed as duty rather than achievement, their identities defined more by their roles as wives and mothers than by their individual contributions. The physical spaces they inhabited reflected these differences yet hinted at shared struggles. A noble woman might walk through stone corridors, past tapestries and storerooms filled with supplies, while a peasant woman stepped across earthen floors, with smoke curling from a simple hearth and little beyond the bare necessities. Yet in both spaces, the rhythm of work was unceasing, marked by the preparation of food, the care of children, and the management of daily survival. Both knew the exhaustion of bodies pressed by constant labor, and both found their lives defined by service to others, rather than by freedom of choice. There were of course moments when these worlds intersected. Peasant women worked as servants in noble households, their labor supporting the grandeur of manorial life. Noble women relied upon the agricultural toil of villagers to sustain their estates, their wealth and status inseparable from the efforts of those who lived in cottages beyond the manor gates. The lives of women, though different in scale and circumstance, were thus connected by a web of labor and dependency, each shaping the other in ways that blurred the boundaries of class. Folklore and storytelling sometimes captured these connections, depicting noble women who descended into kitchens or peasants who found themselves drawn into the orbit of manorial life. These tales hinted at an awareness that, despite disparities, women shared burdens of labor and duty that transcended class. Yet the dominant narratives of the time kept them apart. Noble women celebrated for piety or generosity, peasant women left unmentioned, their lives preserved only in the echoes of oral tradition. In the end, the manor and the village represented two poles of medieval womanhood, one marked by the responsibilities of status, the other by the demands of survival. Yet within both, women labored endlessly, their hands shaping the continuity of life, their efforts sustaining the fragile equilibrium of a world vulnerable to famine, disease, and conflict. Their lives reveal a truth that transcends class, that the survival of the medieval world rested not upon the decisions of kings or the conquests of knights, but upon the unrecorded, unrecognized work of women who lived in both manor and village, whose burdens were shared even when their circumstances were not. In the medieval world, faith was not merely a private devotion, but the very fabric upon which society was woven. Churches towered over villages, cathedrals rose above towns, and bells marked the passing of hours, summoning all, noble and peasant alike, into the rhythms of sacred time. For women, religion offered both burden and refuge, shaping their identities, their choices, and the narratives that would outlast their lives. The church, vast in its power, dictated how women were to be understood, daughters of Eve, prone to weakness and sin, yet also vessels of purity when modelled upon the Virgin Mary. Within this tension, women sought spaces of meaning, some confined by doctrine, others daring to shape it. Their voices carried in whispered prayers, in convent chants, and in the visions of mystics who claimed to see the divine directly. The convent stood as one of the few alternatives to the path of marriage and motherhood. In a society where a woman's life was largely mapped from birth to betrothal to childbearing, the cloister offered a different trajectory, one not without hardship, but rich with possibility. A girl placed in a convent might be a noble daughter, whose family sought spiritual prestige, or a younger child for whom there was no dowry to secure a husband. Behind stone walls and under the gaze of abbesses, such women exchanged worldly duties for the ordered life of prayer, fasting, labor, and contemplation. Here the rhythm of bells marked the hours not with fieldwork or estate management, but with psalms sung in choir, with scripture copied by candlelight, and with meditations that turned their thoughts heavenward. For some this life was a sanctuary, a space of learning unavailable elsewhere. Convents preserved literacy, teaching women to read Latin prayers, to illuminate manuscripts, and to engage with theology. Within these walls, women could become scholars, healers, or advisors, their influence stretching quietly beyond the cloister. They copied texts that carried the words of Scripture into future generations, tended herb gardens that provided medicines, and sometimes advised kings or bishops who valued their counsel. Yet for others, convent life was less a choice than an obligation, a place where daughters were sent not for personal devotion, but for family advantage, where vows of obedience and chastity were expected rather than embraced. Beyond the convent, faith shaped women's lives in the parish church, the focal point of village existence. Here peasant women knelt beside their neighbors, offering prayers for health, for children, for rain or harvest. They decorated altars with flowers, carried candles in processions, and observed the feast days that punctuated the year. Religion gave meaning to their daily hardships, promising salvation beyond earthly toil. Yet it also reinforced the limits of their roles, sermons reminding them of their supposed frailty, priests cautioning them against transgression, confession binding their consciences to the oversight of male clergy. Faith offered comfort, but it also deepened submission, a paradox that defined women's religious existence. And yet within these structures, some women carved out extraordinary paths as mystics, visionaries, and saints. Across Europe, women reported visions of Christ, of the Virgin, of angels and heavenly realms. Figures like Hildegard of Bingen, Julian of Norwich, and Catherine of Siena spoke of divine encounters that challenged the authority of men. Hildegard composed music, and wrote theological treatises, her visions acknowledged by popes and emperors. Catherine dictated letters that stirred politics, urging the Pope to return to Rome from Avignon. Julian wrote of divine love in language that reimagined God as both father and mother, daring to describe the divine in terms that embraced tenderness as well as authority. These women's voices reached beyond cloisters, shaping spiritual landscapes in ways that could not easily be ignored. Yet the Church, wary of women's influence, often sought to silence or control them. Mystics were sometimes celebrated, sometimes condemned, their words scrutinized for heresy. Female saints were venerated, but usually for their humility, chastity, or martyrdom, rather than for intellectual or theological contributions. Women who stepped too far beyond accepted boundaries risked censure, even persecution, their visions dismissed as hysteria, their piety recast as delusion. For every Hildegard who achieved recognition, there were countless unnamed women whose mystical experiences remained unheard or suppressed, preserved only in local memory, or in texts altered by male scribes. The duality of reverence and restriction ran deep. Women were exalted as symbols of purity, the Virgin Mary held as the ultimate ideal, but ordinary women were warned of their sinful nature, heirs of Eve's temptation. Saints' lives often presented impossible models, portraying women who renounced marriage, endured suffering, or died in defense of chastity. These stories offered inspiration, but also reinforced the idea that holiness for women meant denial of self, endurance of pain, and absolute submission to divine will. To be holy was to withdraw from the ordinary, to embrace sacrifice so complete that one's individuality dissolved into sainthood. Still, women found ways to live their faith with resilience and creativity. Parish guilds allowed them to participate in collective devotion, to sponsor candles, or to contribute to church upkeep. Pilgrimages offered moments of freedom, journeys where women could step outside the confines of village or manor, walking roads that led to shrines and relics, their prayers mingling with those of strangers. In such acts, women expressed devotion in tangible ways, carrying tokens, lighting candles, or whispering prayers over bones said to belong to saints. Faith was not only an institution imposed upon them, but also a personal practice that gave shape to their hopes, fears, and longings. Religion also shaped the memory of women, deciding which lives would be preserved and which forgotten. Some were remembered in hagiographies, their stories written to inspire devotion, though often reshaped by men who filtered their voices through doctrinal expectations. Others lived only in the margins of parish records, their names appearing in baptisms, marriages, or burial notes, with no hint of their inner lives. And yet, across these traces, the persistence of faith emerges. Women who prayed through famine, who sang in cloisters, who saw visions in the silence of night, leaving behind echoes that still resonate. In the end, the story of women and faith in the Middle Ages is a story of paradox. Religion confined them within structures that reinforced obedience, yet it also offered the rare possibility of education, authority, and transcendence. It silenced their voices, yet it also amplified those few who dared to speak in divine tones. It burdened them with ideals of purity and submission, yet it also gave them a language through which to imagine themselves as more than daughters, wives, or mothers. In convents and cathedrals, in parish churches and pilgrimage roads, women lived their faith with a persistence that sustained not only their own lives, but the spiritual life of the entire medieval world. In the quiet corners of medieval life, away from parchment scrolls and cathedral schools, there thrived another kind of knowledge, one not written in Latin, or preserved in libraries, but carried in memory, in practice, in whispered instructions passed from mother to daughter. It was the knowledge of women, of healing herbs gathered at dawn, of charms spoken over the sick, of the rhythms of birth and the mysteries of the body. It was knowledge often dismissed by clerics, condemned as superstition, and yet it remained indispensable to survival in a world where sickness, injury, and childbirth touched every household. Midwives stood at the center of this world, women whose expertise was trusted at the most dangerous and sacred moment of life, birth. In an age when mortality rates for mothers and infants were devastatingly high, the presence of a midwife could mean the difference between life and death. She carried with her not only skill but also ritual, for childbirth was as much spiritual as it was physical. A midwife knew how to position a laboring woman, how to soothe with words, how to apply warm compresses or herbal infusions. She also knew prayers, protective charms and blessings, murmured to guard against the unseen forces believed to hover in moments of vulnerability. Her role was essential, yet it rarely appeared in records, for the church and the law did not see her as a professional, but merely as a woman performing her duty within the community. Beyond childbirth, women carried vast knowledge of herbs and remedies. They knew which leaves could ease fevers, which roots could settle a troubled stomach, which poultices could draw infection from a wound. This knowledge was gathered over generations, tested not in universities but in fields, kitchens and hearths. A woman might pass down recipes for teas to calm coughing children, ointments to heal burns, or mixtures to reduce swelling. Many of these remedies worked, and some formed the foundation of later medicine. Yet because they were transmitted orally, without the authority of written Latin texts, they were often dismissed by educated men who dominated formal medicine. Still, the role of female healers was irreplaceable. In villages far from towns or monasteries, there were no physicians to summon, no surgeons trained in universities. Instead, when illness struck, neighbors turned to women who had the knowledge to help. These healers blended the practical with the spiritual, offering herbs alongside prayers, treating the body while acknowledging the soul. Their practice blurred the boundaries between medicine, religion and magic, for in the medieval mind these spheres were never entirely separate. To heal was to negotiate not only with the body, but with the unseen world of sin, demons and divine will. But this very blending made women vulnerable. The church, always wary of practices beyond its control, regarded female healers with suspicion. While monasteries cultivated herb gardens and monks wrote treatises on medicine, women's remedies were branded as unlearned, even dangerous. The midwife who spoke charms over a mother in labor, the healer who muttered words while mixing a salve, the neighbor who offered an amulet against fevers, all could be accused of superstition, or worse, of witchcraft. In times of crisis, when crops failed or plague spread, it was often these women who became scapegoats, their once trusted knowledge recast as alliance with the devil, and yet their services could not be dispensed with. Even priests, though quick to condemn, often relied upon local women to tend the sick, for they lacked the practical skills to do so themselves. Records show that midwives were sometimes even called upon to perform emergency baptisms when infants were born in peril, a sacred responsibility granted out of necessity. In these moments, the church acknowledged their importance, even as it circumscribed their authority. The paradox of women's knowledge was clear: indispensable in practice, invisible in recognition, tolerated when useful, condemned when threatening. In noble households, women's knowledge sometimes took different forms. Noble women often managed estates in their husband's absence, which required not only organizational skill, but also familiarity with remedies to maintain the health of households. Some noble women cultivated physic gardens, spaces devoted to medicinal plants, where herbs were grown with both practical and symbolic purposes. Manuscripts occasionally reveal women as patrons of medical texts, commissioning translations into vernacular languages so that remedies could be more widely understood. These women stood at the intersection of written and oral knowledge, bridging the gap between formal learning and household practice. The stories of individual women occasionally pierce through the silence of history. Trotula of Salerno, a 12th century figure associated with the medical school of Salerno in Italy, became legendary for her writings on women's health and childbirth. Though much debated, the texts attributed to her, the Trotula Compendia, offered insights into gynecology and cosmetics, blending practical remedies with observations about women's bodies. Whether written by her or later attributed to her, these works suggest a recognition, however rare, of female authority in medicine. Yet Trotula was the exception. Most women's knowledge remained unrecorded, preserved only in the shadows of practice. Even in literature, echoes of women's healing appear. Folk tales speak of wise women who lived at the edges of villages, sought out in times of need, but avoided when times were good. Chronicles sometimes mention women accused of using potions to seduce or harm, evidence of both fear and fascination with their craft. These glimpses reveal how deeply embedded women's knowledge was in medieval imagination, at once revered and distrusted, a force both vital and unsettling. The fragility of this oral tradition meant much of it has been lost. What survives are fragments, recipes recorded by male scribes, confessions extracted under duress, references buried in manorial rolls, or ecclesiastical decrees. Yet behind these fragments lies a vast unacknowledged inheritance, the thousands of unnamed women who healed wounds, eased fevers, delivered infants and comforted the dying. Their knowledge was practical, intuitive, tested by necessity rather than theory, and while it rarely entered the annals of history, it shaped the daily survival of medieval society. To imagine medieval life without these women is impossible. Without midwives, childbirth would have been even more perilous. Without herbalists, illnesses would have gone untreated. Without healers, communities would have been left without recourse in times of crisis. And yet, the memory of these women has faded, obscured by centuries of suspicion and dismissal. They were condemned as superstitious, their remedies dismissed as unscientific, their very presence recast as dangerous. The history of women's knowledge is thus a history of erasure, of wisdom that sustained but was seldom honored, of skill that was essential but rarely celebrated. In the end, women's knowledge in the Middle Ages reveals the paradox of their place in society, vital yet invisible, trusted yet distrusted, central to survival yet peripheral in record. It speaks of resilience, of an inheritance carried not in books but in memory, whispered from one generation to the next, until the echoes faded. What remains are fragments, enough to remind us that the survival of medieval communities was not sustained only by kings or knights, nor by scholars or priests, but by women whose hands gathered herbs, soothed laboring mothers, and kept alive a body of knowledge too humble for chronicles yet too essential to be forgotten entirely. The medieval town was alive with sound and movement, its narrow streets crowded with stalls, shops and workshops. The air carried the clang of blacksmiths at their forges, the chatter of traders at market, the steady rhythm of looms, and the scent of bread wafting from ovens. Within this bustling world of commerce and craft, women were present everywhere. Though history often chose to forget them, they worked beside husbands at benches and looms, sold goods in marketplaces, and passed down skills to daughters and apprentices. They shaped cloth, brewed ale, and prepared wares. Their labor as essential to the urban economy as any man's. Yet in the written records of guilds and chronicles, their names fade into absence, overshadowed by the official recognition given almost exclusively to men. In towns across Europe, guilds emerged as the dominant institutions of craft and trade. These organizations regulated quality, controlled apprenticeships, and maintained the privileges of their members. To belong to a guild was to hold status and security, to have a place in the economic and social hierarchy of the medieval town. For men, guild membership was a badge of recognition. For women, it was a door often closed. Some guilds excluded women entirely, while others allowed them only as widows continuing a husband's trade. Still, women found ways to work, sometimes as silent partners in workshops, sometimes as independent artisans whose labor was simply recorded under another's name. The textile industry, one of the largest and most vital trades of the medieval economy, was filled with women's labor. From spinning wool to weaving cloth, from dyeing to finishing, women's hands were everywhere in the production chain. In villages, peasant women spun thread for urban weavers, their work so widespread that spinning wheels became a universal emblem of female labor. In towns, women worked in weaving workshops, sometimes alongside husbands, sometimes alone, producing fabric that clothed not only their communities but also distant markets. Yet while men might sign contracts and join guilds as master weavers, women's contributions were rarely acknowledged in ledgers or statutes. Their work was indispensable, yet their names remain unrecorded, their presence obscured behind the authority of male guild structures. Brewing was another craft where women played a central role. Ale was a staple of medieval diets, safer to drink than water, and brewing was often managed at the household level. Many women brewed small batches to sell in markets or taverns, earning vital income. Known as alewives, these women sustained communities with their product, yet their role was fraught with suspicion. alewives were frequently caricatured in popular culture, mocked in poems and morality tales as dishonest or bawdy, their work devalued even as it fed the town. By the later Middle Ages, brewing increasingly shifted toward larger operations dominated by men, and women were pushed out of a trade they had once defined. Merchants' wives, too, carried immense responsibilities. While their husbands traveled to fairs or distant ports, women managed shops, balanced accounts, and oversaw apprentices. In many cases, the smooth running of a business depended entirely on a wife's competence, yet guild statutes rarely acknowledged her role. Widows sometimes inherited businesses and continued trading, their status protected so long as they did not remarry. Some prospered, becoming respected figures in their towns, though their authority was always precarious, dependent upon their late husbands' legacies rather than their own recognition. In certain crafts, women gained more visibility. Midwives, though rarely guild members, formed loose associations that regulated practice in towns, with city authorities sometimes licensing their work. In Paris and other urban centers, silk weaving and embroidery employed large numbers of women, some of whom rose to prominence for their skill. Embroiderers produced intricate altar cloths, tapestries, and garments, works that adorned churches and noble households, their artistry admired even if their names were not preserved. Yet even in these fields, women's status was fragile, subject to restrictions that limited their independence. The erasure of women from guild records was not merely an oversight, but a reflection of deeper anxieties. Guilds were as much about identity and hierarchy as they were about trade, and to admit women as full members challenged notions of authority and control. Women's labor was accepted, even relied upon, but formal recognition threatened to blur boundaries that the patriarchal order sought to maintain. As a result, women occupied a shadowed space, visible in daily practice, invisible in official record, their contributions taken for granted yet systematically unacknowledged. Still, glimpses of their presence survive. Court records reveal disputes involving women artisans defending their rights. Contracts show wives standing as guarantors for business dealings, and wills occasionally mention daughters inheriting tools of trade. In some towns, a few guilds, particularly in textiles or food trades, permitted women as members, though often with limited rights compared to men. These fragments remind us that women were not passive observers of urban craft, but active participants, negotiating spaces within a system designed to marginalize them. The social world of guilds also reflected these exclusions. Guilds hosted feasts, processions, and religious observances that reinforced bonds of brotherhood. Women might participate on the margins, preparing food, sewing banners, attending as wives, but rarely as equals. Their absence from these rituals deepened their invisibility, ensuring that the memory of towns and trades was written as a story of men, even when women's work lay at the heart of economic life. And yet, despite this exclusion, women's labor sustained the vibrancy of medieval towns. Without spinners, weavers, embroiderers, brewers, and shopkeepers' wives, the urban economy would have faltered. The cloth trade that enriched merchants, the ale that sustained workers, the goods sold in marketplaces, all bore the mark of women's hands. The contradiction between practice and record reveals much about medieval society, that it could not survive without women, yet it refused to fully acknowledge them. In the end, women in guilds and crafts embody the broader paradox of medieval womanhood, essential yet invisible, central yet marginalized, remembered not in names or statutes, but in the silent continuity of labor. The workshops and markets of medieval towns were filled with their presence, though history has left only faint traces. To walk through a medieval marketplace in imagination is to see them everywhere, in aprons at stalls, at looms in dim workshops, stirring vats of ale, or tallying coins behind a counter. Women whose work sustained the towns yet whose voices were written out of their stories. The Middle Ages was an era marked not only by the steady rhythms of agricultural life, the bells of churches, and the labor of guilds, but also by the constant shadow of war. Wars came in many forms: dynastic struggles between noble houses, invasions by foreign armies, raids launched across contested borders, and the relentless conflicts of kings who sought to expand or defend their territories. In this world of swords and banners, the chroniclers wrote of knights and commanders, of campaigns and treaties. Yet behind those stories lay another reality, largely unrecorded, the experience of women, whose lives were shaped by war in ways both quiet and devastating. For noble women, war often meant responsibility. When lords and knights rode off to fight, castles and estates did not simply fall silent. They had to be managed, defended, and sustained. In such moments, noble women became guardians of strongholds, charged with maintaining order, negotiating with neighbors, and ensuring that retainers remained loyal. Chronicles occasionally record women defending castles under siege, standing at battlements, overseeing supplies, or even directing men-at-arms in their husband's absence. While not common, these moments reveal how women of rank were forced into roles of authority. When war drew men away, their names survive only faintly, mentioned as widows who held out against invaders, or as guardians who kept an estate intact until a son or husband returned. Yet even in these rare acknowledgements, it is clear that noble women bore burdens not often recognized in the heroic language of knights and kings. For peasant women, the experience of war was more often one of suffering than of authority. Villages lay in the path of armies, and armies required food, shelter, and resources. Soldiers plundered crops, drove off livestock, and set fire to homes. Women fled with children, carrying what they could, or endured the violence that followed occupation. Raids and skirmishes meant not only material loss but also the terror of assaults, for women were especially vulnerable in the chaos of pillage. Chroniclers seldom recorded these experiences, for they were deemed unworthy of annals, but the absence of such accounts does not erase their reality. War pressed heavily upon women of the countryside, stripping away the little security their labor had built. The toll of conflict extended into every corner of female life. When men fell in battle, widows were left to navigate inheritance laws, dowry claims, and the challenge of supporting children in a world where women rarely had legal independence. Some widows took over farms or businesses, their survival depending on their ability to maintain productivity and ward off predatory claims from male relatives or neighbors. Others were forced into remarriage, their futures decided less by choice than by necessity, or the negotiations of families seeking to secure land and resources. War not only killed men, but also reshaped the lives of the women left behind, binding them to new patterns of dependence or responsibility. In towns, women also felt the reverberations of war. Markets emptied when trade routes were disrupted, and guild workshops slowed when supplies grew scarce. Women who worked in textiles, brewing, or small trades found their incomes diminished. Refugees from the countryside sometimes crowded into cities, increasing hardship. Noble women within towns might be called upon to contribute to defense, organizing supplies or offering patronage for fortifications. For ordinary women, survival meant adapting to scarcity, finding ways to feed families amid shortages, or joining others in communal efforts to rebuild after destruction. There were also women who followed armies, though their stories are rarely told. Some were wives of soldiers, others were camp followers who cooked, washed, or tended to the wounded. These women lived on the margins of military life, exposed to the same dangers as soldiers, but without honor or recognition. They walked the long marches, endured the hunger of campaigns, and faced the violence of battles without their names ever entering record. Their existence reminds us that war was not confined to men on horseback but encompassed a wide web of support in which women too were present. Religion framed much of how war was understood, and here again women's lives were caught in its narratives. The church often preached that women must endure suffering in silence, bearing the losses of war as a form of piety. Yet women also sought divine protection in times of conflict, turning to saints and relics, lighting candles, or participating in processions to ward off danger. In some cases, holy women and mystics interpreted wars as signs of divine judgment, their visions reinforcing or challenging the meaning of conflict. Faith offered women a way to frame the chaos around them, even as it did little to alleviate the harsh material realities they faced. War also touched women indirectly, through taxation and levies. To fund campaigns, rulers imposed taxes that reached into every household, and women, often managing estates or farms in men's absence, were responsible for meeting these demands. The burdens of provisioning armies, supplying grain, or surrendering livestock fell heavily upon them. In towns, guilds were taxed for war efforts, and households, many managed by women, bore the strain. The reach of conflict extended far beyond the battlefield, penetrating daily life through demands that extracted labor and resources from women already struggling to maintain families. Yet amid the suffering, there were moments of resilience. Women rebuilt homes, replanted fields, and re-established communities after armies passed. They maintained continuity in the face of disruption, preserving families and traditions when structures of power collapsed around them. Noble women held estates together for heirs, peasant women re-established farms, and townspeople reopened shops, ensuring that life continued even when war threatened to shatter it. This quiet persistence, unrecorded by chroniclers, was as vital to survival as the victories of generals or the treaties of kings. The silence of history on women's experience of war is telling. Chronicles focused on campaigns, not consequences, on knights, not peasants, on kings, not widows. Yet if one looks closely, fragments appear, mentions of castles held by noble women, records of widows petitioning for rights, tales of villages rebuilt by communal effort. These fragments remind us that women were not absent from war, but rather lived its realities in ways that official records preferred to overlook. Their stories, though shadowed, reveal that the burden of conflict was borne not only on battlefields but also in kitchens, fields, and households where women struggled to endure. In the end, the story of women and war in the Middle Ages is not one of triumph or glory, but of endurance. Noble women defended estates with quiet authority. Peasant women rebuilt after devastation. Widows navigated the complexities of survival, and countless unnamed women carried the toll of violence in their bodies and memories. War wrote itself upon the lives of women as surely as upon the annals of kings, though their record remains hidden, waiting to be remembered. In the long centuries of the Middle Ages, the structures of law governed nearly every aspect of daily life, though seldom did those structures weigh equally upon all who lived beneath them. All women in particular existed in a legal world that defined them not as independent actors, but as dependents whose rights were filtered through the authority of fathers, husbands, or male relatives. The medieval understanding of law was deeply entwined with ideas of hierarchy, property, and divine order, and within that framework women were placed firmly beneath male guardianship, their agency circumscribed by rules that reflected not only secular power, but also the teachings of the Church. To trace the legal position of women in this era is to see a landscape where autonomy was rare, dependence was constant, and the written codes often silenced the lived realities of female life. From birth, a woman's legal identity was linked to her family rather than to herself. Daughters were considered under the mundium, the guardianship of their fathers. This guardianship carried with it the duty of protection and maintenance, but also the right to control marriages, dowries, and inheritances. Fathers arranged marriages not merely as personal decisions, but as legal and economic contracts, binding daughters into alliances that served the interests of kinship and property, rather than individual preference. Inheritance customs varied across regions, but in many places, daughters were entitled only to a dowry rather than to equal shares of land or wealth. The dowry was intended as both a form of provision and as compensation for exclusion from larger estates. Thus, even before adulthood, the law placed daughters into a framework where their future was determined by male decisions and property transactions. Upon marriage, guardianship passed from father to husband, and with it the legal status of the woman. In most medieval societies, a married woman was considered fin covert, covered by the legal identity of her husband. This doctrine of coverture meant that a wife could not own property independently, enter contracts, or represent herself in court without her husband's consent. Land that she might bring into the marriage was often administered by her husband, though customs varied as to whether she retained partial rights of inheritance. In practice, this meant that a woman's economic position was dependent on the fortunes of her spouse, and her ability to act legally was bound tightly to his authority. Her labor and contributions were assumed to belong to the household, subsumed under the broader framework of male legal control. There were, however, exceptions and variations that reveal cracks in this rigid order. Widows, for instance, often occupied a unique space in the medieval legal system. Without a living husband, they could, at least in theory, manage property, conduct business, and represent themselves in courts. Many widows petitioned for their rights to dower land, parcels granted for their maintenance after a husband's death, and the records of such petitions reveal how widows could use the courts to assert their claims. Some took over farms, taverns, or workshops, functioning as heads of households in ways that were not possible during marriage. Yet even this autonomy was precarious, for widows were frequently pressured into remarriage, sometimes to consolidate alliances, or to return them under the guardianship of a male figure. The temporary freedom of widowhood was thus both real and fragile, dependent on circumstance and vulnerable to erasure. Customary law often dictated how women were treated, and these customs varied significantly across Europe. In parts of southern France, daughters could inherit alongside sons under Roman-influenced law, while in much of northern Europe, primogeniture and male preference were the norm. Town charters sometimes allowed women limited rights in commerce, particularly in markets and guilds, where a widow could continue her husband's trade. Peasant communities had their own informal customs, where women participated in land transactions or village courts, though their voices carried less weight than men's. Despite these variations, the unifying thread was always the presumption of male authority, with female involvement tolerated only when framed by necessity or absence of men. Criminal law, too, reflected the subordinate position of women. In many cases, punishments for women were harsher, tied to notions of morality and sexual conduct. Accusations of adultery or unchastity carried severe social and legal consequences, sometimes leading to public shaming or even harsher penalties, while similar offenses by men were treated with greater leniency. Women accused of theft or disorder were often punished more visibly, with the idea that female misbehavior threatened social order more profoundly than male misdeeds. At the same time, women were vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft or heresy, especially in later medieval centuries, when superstition and ecclesiastical law merged to create new avenues of suspicion. These charges often targeted women whose knowledge, independence, or poverty placed them outside the accepted norms of society. Despite these constraints, there are scattered glimpses of female legal agency. Some noble women acted as regents for underage heirs, wielding significant power over estates, and using the law to enforce their claims. In towns, a few women ran businesses in their own names, appearing in legal records as debtors, creditors, or plaintiffs. Religious women, particularly abbesses, could exercise considerable authority over convent lands, negotiating with secular lords and defending their institutions in court. These examples, while rare, show that women could and did engage with the law when circumstances allowed, though their autonomy was always framed as exceptional rather than normative. The role of the Church further reinforced the subordinate legal status of women. Canon law, drawing from biblical interpretation and the writings of Church Fathers, emphasized the obedience of wives, the sanctity of marriage, and the duty of female submission. Ecclesiastical courts, which handled cases of marriage, morality, and inheritance disputes, often ruled in ways that upheld male authority. Yet paradoxically, the Church also provided some protections. It could prevent forced marriages, recognize the rights of widows to refuse remarriage, and safeguard certain aspects of dowries. The Church's influence thus both restricted and preserved women's legal position, a duality that reflected the complex nature of medieval religious and legal thought. The silence of the records is perhaps the most telling aspect of women and law. Most legal documents were drawn up by men, for men, with women appearing only as dependents, widows, or anomalies. The countless daily negotiations, disputes, and compromises that women engaged in at the village or household level went unrecorded, leaving us only with scattered references. The absence of female voices in charters, court rolls, and chronicles reflects not their lack of involvement, but the legal system's refusal to recognize them as autonomous actors. Yet within this silence, women navigated the law in practical ways. They used marriage contracts to secure dowries, called upon kinship networks to defend their rights, and when necessary, appealed to courts for redress. They learned the boundaries of what was possible, and adapted their strategies accordingly. Their lives remind us that law in the Middle Ages was not an abstract set of codes, but a living system of negotiation, shaped as much by custom and necessity as by formal rules. Women lived within it, constrained by its strictures, but not entirely erased by them, carving out spaces of agency, where they could, however limited those spaces might be. In sum, the medieval legal system presented women as dependents, defined through fathers and husbands, with only rare openings for autonomy. The framework of guardianship, coverture, and ecclesiastical authority left little room for independence, yet widows, abbesses, and women of exceptional circumstance sometimes stepped outside these limits. While the majority of women remained legally invisible, their quiet navigation of the system reveals resilience in the face of structures designed to diminish them. Their forgotten stories, hidden in legal fragments, speak to a world where the law sought to silence them, yet their endurance ensured they were never entirely erased. When one looks back into the textual remains of the medieval centuries, the impression is often of a world written almost entirely by men, for men, and about men. Chronicles, sermons, court records and epics carry forward the names of kings, knights, abbots and bishops, while the voices of women seem faint, sometimes absent altogether, drowned beneath the long cadence of male-centered narration. This silence in the written word is not the silence of women themselves, who undoubtedly spoke, sang, composed, prayed, and remembered, but rather the silence of preservation, where the filters of literacy, clerical authority, and social hierarchy determined whose voices were deemed worthy of ink and parchment. To examine medieval literature is to walk through halls where women's footsteps can be faintly heard in the dust, though their portraits are missing from the walls. The dominant literary forms of the Middle Ages were shaped by clerical culture. Monks, clerics and scholars, trained in Latin and immersed in the writings of the Church Fathers, preserved knowledge in scriptoria and schools. These men determined what texts were copied, circulated, and studied. Chronicles recorded the deeds of kings and battles, saints' lives were written to inspire piety, and theological treatises debated points of doctrine. Within such traditions, women appeared only incidentally, as wives exchanged in dynastic marriages, as pious figures whose chastity or martyrdom reinforced spiritual lessons, or as archetypes, Eve as the origin of sin, Mary as the vessel of redemption. Their individuality dissolved into allegory. The very structure of medieval literary preservation positioned women more as symbols than as living voices. Yet if the grand genres of medieval writing largely erased women, quieter forms of expression reveal their presence. Private letters, for instance, offer fleeting glimpses into the lives of women who, though seldom celebrated in chronicles, left behind the traces of their thoughts. Noble women corresponded with husbands, sons and clerics, discussing estates, alliances, and even personal feelings. Some of these letters survive in scattered collections, preserved not for the sake of the women themselves, but because of the men to whom they were addressed. Still, they reveal that women could and did use the written word to manage households, negotiate dowries, and maintain networks of kinship. These letters remind us that the silence of literature was not absolute. It was more an erasure from official narratives than an absence of expression. Religious writing offered another space, narrow but significant, where women's voices found a channel. In convents, literate nuns composed prayers, meditations, and visionary accounts of mystical experiences. Hildegard of Bingen in the 12th century is perhaps the most famous, her works blending theology, natural philosophy, and music. But beyond Hildegard were many lesser-known sisters who recorded their visions, wrote devotional poetry, or maintained convent chronicles. Their writings, though often filtered through clerical oversight, carried distinctive tones, intimate, visionary, and deeply personal. These works reveal that medieval women could produce literature when conditions allowed, though their survival was precarious and often dependent on the approval of male confessors or patrons. Poetry, too, occasionally preserved female voices, though often indirectly. In the south of France, the Trouberites, female troubadours, composed songs of love and longing in the 12th and 13th centuries. Their poems, though few survive, stand as rare examples of secular literature authored by women. They wrote of desire, fidelity, and the dynamics of courtly love, challenging the idea that women were only passive subjects of male longing. Yet their songs were exceptions in a literary culture dominated by men, and the fragmentary survival of their work illustrates how easily women's contributions could be lost when scribes and compilers chose which texts to preserve. Outside of poetry and letters, prayers offer another shadowed trace of women's literary presence. Prayer books, often personalized with marginalia, show how women engaged with the written word as readers and sometimes as authors of devotional petitions. These texts, filled with appeals to saints, intercessions for family, and reflections on suffering, reveal a quiet world of female spirituality. In their margins, women inscribed notes, names or symbols, leaving behind the faintest marks of their lived faith. Though not literature in the grand sense, such writings testify to women's engagement with text, a counterpoint to the silence of chronicles and epics. The absence of women in major chronicles is striking not only in what it omits, but also in what it suggests about medieval perceptions of authority. Chronicles were meant to record deeds that shaped kingdoms and Christendom itself. Women, by the logic of medieval chroniclers, did not belong to this category unless they were queens, saints, or occasionally regents. Even then, their appearances were filtered through male perspectives, their actions framed as supportive of dynasties rather than expressions of personal agency. Thus, when Eleanor of Aquitaine or Blanche of Castile appears in chronicles, they are remembered less for their individuality than for their relation to kings and sons. Countless other women, whose decisions influenced families, villages, and even politics, remained outside the written record. This silence of literature shaped the way history itself was remembered. For later generations, the Middle Ages appeared as a male-centered world, not only because men dominated power, but because men controlled memory. The erasure of women's voices from chronicles created the illusion that they had little to say, when in fact it was the channels of preservation that silenced them. The endurance of a few exceptional texts, Hildegard's visionary writings, the songs of the Troberites, the letters of Christine de Pizan, stands out not because they were isolated, but because they are the rare survivors of what was likely a broader, but less preserved, landscape of female expression. Christine de Pizan in the early 15th century represents a turning point in this long silence. Widowed and needing to support her family, she turned to writing, producing works of poetry, political thought, and even proto-feminist arguments. Her book of The City of Ladies explicitly challenged the exclusion of women from literary tradition, constructing an allegorical city where women's virtues were honored. Christine's works survive not only because she wrote them, but because she was able to secure patronage and recognition in a courtly context. Her career illustrates both the barriers women faced and the possibilities available when talent, circumstance, and support aligned. It is tempting to read the silence of medieval literature as evidence of passivity, but silence can also be a form of absence imposed from outside. Women's contributions to oral culture, songs sung at spinning wheels, stories told at hearths, laments recited at funerals, were real and significant, though seldom written down. These oral traditions, vibrant and sustaining, existed alongside the written record, yet because they were not preserved in ink, they faded from historical memory. What survives, then, is not the totality of medieval women's voices, but a distorted fragment, shaped by the priorities of male scribes and chroniclers. In reflecting on the silence of literature, one sees not only the marginalization of women, but also the resilience of their presence. They appear in letters, in convent writings, in prayers, in the rare flourishes of poetry, and in the survival of figures like Christine de Pizan, who refused erasure. Though the chronicles chose not to write them in, their traces remain, reminding us that absence in the record is not the same as absence in reality. It is the task of history to listen closely to these faint echoes, piecing together the forgotten stories that conventional literature left unsaid. In the landscape of medieval life, where sickness was constant, childbirth perilous, and medicine as much a matter of faith as of science, women were at the center of healing. They were the ones who tended the sick within households, assisted in births, prepared herbal remedies, and preserved fragments of practical knowledge that had been passed down orally through generations. Yet the same role that made them indispensable also made them vulnerable. The healer could as easily be recast as a witch, and the wisdom that comforted neighbors in times of pain might, under different circumstances, become evidence of malice or sorcery. The line between respected midwife and cursed witch was thin, blurred by fear, suspicion, and the shifting tides of social anxiety. In every village and town, women were the primary caregivers. Learned physicians existed, but they were few, costly, and concentrated in urban centers. For the majority of people, peasants, craftsmen, and even many of the lower nobility, medical assistance was sought locally, and most often from women. Midwives attended births, drawing upon accumulated experience of the female body that male physicians seldom possessed. Herbalists prepared remedies for fevers, stomach ailments, or wounds, relying on a blend of observation, tradition, and trial. These practices were seldom written down. They were transmitted orally, from older women to younger, woven into the rhythms of family and community life. Such knowledge did not carry prestige in the formal world of universities or clerical medicine, yet it was essential to survival. Midwives in particular occupied a paradoxical role. On one hand, they were respected figures, called upon in moments of crisis, trusted to guide both mother and child through the dangers of birth. Ecclesiastical authorities sometimes even granted them special recognition, as in the case of midwives authorized to perform emergency baptisms if an infant's life was in danger. On the other hand, their intimate knowledge of female bodies, their power over the threshold of life and death, and their independence from male authority could arouse suspicion. In times when childbirth ended in tragedy, or when illness spread inexplicably, it was easy for neighbors to recast the midwife, not as helper, but as cause. The same hands that had once been praised for saving an infant could be accused of killing another through witchcraft. The fragility of women's roles as healers becomes clearer when placed against the backdrop of formal medicine. From the 12th century onward, universities began to codify medical learning, drawing on Greek, Roman, and Arabic sources. This academic medicine was almost exclusively male, written in Latin, and practiced by physicians who belonged to professional guilds. Women were largely excluded from this world. Their knowledge, because it was practical, oral, and outside the framework of written authority, was dismissed as superstition. Yet for most people, it was women's remedies, not university medicine, that they actually encountered. This disparity between lived practice and formal recognition created the conditions in which women's healing could be reinterpreted as dangerous. The association of women with witchcraft was not unique to medicine, but medicine made the association more potent. Healing required an understanding of herbs, of plants that soothed, or plants that poisoned. It required rituals, prayers, and charms, for the medieval world did not distinguish sharply between natural and supernatural cures. A whispered blessing over a poultice, or the use of a charm against fever, could be seen as pious in one context and as diabolical in another. The fluidity of these categories meant that women healers constantly navigated a narrow path, where the boundary between accepted practice and condemned magic could shift with the fears of a community. Fear was often the catalyst for turning healer into witch. When plagues swept through villages, when cattle died mysteriously, when children sickened without explanation, people sought causes. In a world where natural explanations were poorly understood, suspicion often fell on those whose knowledge set them apart. A midwife who had attended many births, an old woman who lived alone and dispensed herbs, a widow whose remedies had sometimes failed. These were figures easily cast as scapegoats. The narrative of witchcraft drew upon long-standing stereotypes of female weakness, sin, and association with the devil, all of which were reinforced by clerical preaching. Thus, women who had once been sought after for healing could, in the next moment, be condemned as threats. This tension deepened in the later Middle Ages, as anxieties about heresy, the devil, and social disorder grew. Manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum in the 15th century codified fears of witches, focusing disproportionately on women and linking their supposed powers to sexuality, fertility, and the corruption of life itself. Though large-scale witch persecutions were more characteristic of the early modern period, the groundwork was laid in medieval thought. Women who healed outside official structures, who exercised authority over bodies and births, became vulnerable targets in this climate of suspicion. The very qualities that made them valuable, knowledge, independence and influence, were reinterpreted as evidence of danger. Yet it would be misleading to see medieval women only as victims of these narratives. Many continued to practice healing openly, supported by communities that relied on their skills. Town records occasionally mention women licensed to serve as midwives, their authority acknowledged by civic or ecclesiastical officials. Some convents became centers of female healing, where nuns prepared medicines and cared for the sick, blending spiritual and physical remedies. Women's roles as healers were deeply embedded in society, too essential to be entirely erased, even when suspicion lurked nearby. Their survival within this fragile balance demonstrates the resilience of practical knowledge against the pressures of formal exclusion and superstition. The dual image of healer and witch reflects broader medieval tensions about women's place in society. To heal was to hold power over life and death, and power in women's hands unsettled a patriarchal order that sought to limit female autonomy. By framing some women as witches, society both acknowledged and condemned their influence. The fear-driven narrative of witchcraft became a way to explain misfortune, but it also reinforced structures of control, reminding women that their authority could be tolerated only so long as it conformed to accepted norms. The memory of these women has often been shaped by the fears that surrounded them. Chronicles rarely mention the countless midwives and herbalists who sustained communities, but they do record accusations, trials, and condemnations of witches. As a result, the historical record exaggerates suspicion while understating trust, giving the impression that women healers were more feared than valued. In reality, they were both sought after in times of need, yet feared in times of crisis. The tension between these roles reveals the precariousness of female knowledge in a world where authority was written by men and defined by institutions that excluded them. Today, the traces of these women survive in fragments in accounts of midwives performing baptisms, in recipe books that record remedies for fevers or wounds, in court cases where accusations of witchcraft were leveled. From these pieces, one can glimpse the double life of medieval women as healers and as suspected witches. Their story is not one of clear boundaries but of blurred lines, where respect and fear, necessity and suspicion, coexisted uneasily. In their lives, one sees the deep ambivalence of a society that relied on women's knowledge yet feared its implications. In the medieval imagination, power was rarely pictured with a woman's face. Authority was embodied in kings, lords, bishops, abbots, figures who ruled with the weight of laws, armies, and divine sanction. Yet, despite the overwhelmingly patriarchal order, there were women who ascended to positions of remarkable influence. Some did so as queen's consort, standing beside their husbands in ceremony, yet wielding quiet influence behind the curtain of council chambers. Others ruled as regents during the minority of sons, guiding kingdoms through fragile interludes. A very few, rarer still, took the crown in their own right, becoming sovereign rulers whose names carved small fissures in the edifice of male dominance. But these women's lives were not remembered with clarity or fairness. Their stories filtered through chronicles written by male clerics and court historians, often hostile, often suspicious, and seldom free from the language of distortion. The figure of the queen was central to medieval monarchy, yet her role was double-edged. As consort, she was expected to embody piety, fertility, and loyalty. She bore heirs, mediated disputes, and represented the ideal of harmonious partnership. But queens were also suspected of overstepping bounds, of meddling in affairs beyond their proper sphere. Chroniclers praised them for intercessions of mercy, pleading for prisoners, softening the severity of kings, but condemned them when they wielded power too openly. The queen's authority was permitted only as extension of her husband's. If she pushed beyond, her reputation could swiftly darken. Queens who became regents for underage heirs occupied an even more precarious position. In theory, they governed until sons or nephews reached maturity, but in practice they navigated hostile courts, eager to displace them. Their regencies revealed the fragility of female power in a patriarchal system. A queen mother might be celebrated as guardian of dynastic continuity, yet her every decision was scrutinized, her alliances questioned, her motives maligned. If a kingdom prospered under her care, praise was given sparingly, often attributing success to male advisors. If disaster struck, blame fell heavily, painting her as weak, greedy, or incompetent. Thus, regency magnified both the necessity and the suspicion of women in power. Occasionally, the medieval world witnessed something even more unusual, the rule of a queen in her own right. Figures like Empress Matilda in England, Eleanor of Aquitaine in France and England, or Isabella of Castile in Spain, much later, challenged expectations of gender and sovereignty. Yet, their memory is layered with distortions. Chroniclers struggled to describe them without resorting to stereotypes of unnatural ambition, dangerous femininity, or masculine qualities. A woman who exercised authority was rarely judged by the same measure as a man. Her strength was seen as arrogance, her assertiveness as usurpation, her decisions as suspiciously emotional or manipulative. Or where male rulers were described as bold or resolute, female rulers were often cast as scheming or ruthless. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the 12th century, is a telling example. As Duchess in her own right, Queen of France, later Queen of England, and mother of 2 kings, her influence was vast. Yet, chronicles often emphasize scandal, rumor, and supposed improprieties, eclipsing her administrative skill and political acumen. Her patronage of culture and diplomacy was overshadowed by tales of her alleged rebelliousness, her suspected unfaithfulness, and her supposed meddling in affairs beyond her station. Even in her commanding role, the narrative that survives is filtered through suspicion, revealing more about the biases of her chroniclers than the reality of her rule. The distortion of women in power was not limited to queens, noble women who managed estates during husbands' absences, abbesses who governed wealthy religious houses, and urban women who led guilds or merchant enterprises, were similarly framed in ways that diminished their authority. The chronicler's pen was quick to record moments of failure, scandal, or rebellion, but slow to acknowledge quiet competence. When women preserved stability, their contributions blended into silence. When they faltered, their shortcomings were magnified into parables about the dangers of female ambition. Religious imagery also shaped perceptions. The Virgin Mary was venerated as intercessor, gentle Queen of Heaven, but her model was one of submission and purity. Earthly women in power were measured against this ideal, and inevitably found wanting. If a queen displayed mercy, she echoed Mary. If she displayed strength, she risked comparison with Eve, Pandora, or Jezebel, symbols of temptation, corruption, and downfall. The spectrum of judgment was thus bounded by archetypes, crafted by male imagination, leaving little space for women to be seen on their own terms. Even language betrayed the unease surrounding female rulers. Chroniclers described them with masculine attributes when they succeeded, more man than woman, possessed of a man's courage, implying that authority could not truly be feminine. Conversely, when they erred, they were condemned as women acting against their nature, too weak or too deceitful for the heavy burden of power. In either case, the framework ensured that women's authority was never fully legitimate, always provisional, always an exception to the natural order. And yet, despite distortion, the presence of women in power mattered profoundly. They acted as patrons of monasteries, protectors of towns, arbiters of peace treaties, and guarantors of dynasties. Their signatures appear in charters, their seals validated transactions, their marriages bound realms together. Though chronicles tried to diminish them, the records of governance betray their indispensability. Kingdoms survived because women ruled in times of need, however grudgingly society admitted it. Their authority was exceptional, not because it was rare, but because it was constantly marked as deviation from the expected pattern of male dominion. The silence of women's own voices deepens the distortion. Few queens or noble women left behind direct writings that defended or explained their actions. Their memory survives largely through the words of men who had reasons to question or malign them. Thus, modern historians must read against the grain, piecing together evidence from charters, household accounts and diplomatic records to reconstruct lives flattened by hostile narratives. In doing so, one glimpses a world where women did not passively accept exclusion, but navigated, negotiated, and sometimes resisted the structures that confined them. In the medieval night, when candles burned low in stone halls and clerks copied chronicles onto parchment, the stories of women in power were penned with heavy bias. Yet the traces that remain remind us that power, though structured by patriarchy, was never exclusively male. Women stepped into it, sometimes cautiously, sometimes boldly, and though their memory was reshaped by suspicion, their lives testify to the fragility of a system that could not fully exclude them. Their stories, exceptional and distorted, survive as shadows that still illuminate the uneasy presence of female authority in a world designed to deny it. If the countryside was the backbone of medieval Europe, then the towns and cities were its restless heart, a place of noise, commerce, smells both foul and fragrant, and the ceaseless movement of people drawn together by trade. Unlike the slower rhythms of rural villages, cities demanded constant energy, the clang of blacksmiths, the calls of merchants, the rumble of carts across cobbled streets, and within this crowded, shifting world, women carved out lives of precarious labor, family duty, and quiet endurance. Their presence was woven into every corner of urban survival, yet their names rarely entered the chronicles, for they were seen less as makers of history, and more as fixtures of daily necessity. The medieval marketplace was one of the most visible arenas for women's activity. Stalls and open squares bustled with vendors selling vegetables, fish, bread, ale, and cloth. Many of those voices belonged to women, wives of artisans, widows with no other support, daughters helping their parents' stalls. A woman selling onions, another hawking eggs, another kneading dough at a street-side oven. These were the ordinary scenes of daily life. For some, the market was a family enterprise. For others, it was survival itself, the thin line between hunger and sustenance. Women's stalls were rarely glamorous, yet they ensured that households could eat, and that city dwellers found the goods they needed day by day. Beyond the stalls, women also managed taverns and alehouses, establishments that stood at the center of medieval sociability. Brewing ale was often considered women's work, at least in its smaller domestic scale. Recipes were handed down through households, and wives or widows might turn brewing into modest business. Taverns were places of both necessity and suspicion, necessary because they provided drink and gathering spaces, suspicious because they encouraged disorder, drunkenness, and occasional violence. A woman who ran such a place was both respected as provider and distrusted as potential corrupter of morals. In city records, female tavern keepers appear in fines for watered ale or unlicensed sales, reminders that their economic independence came with scrutiny. Urban households themselves were workplaces, and women were at their center. A city wife often combined the duties of managing children, servants, and boarders with direct involvement in her husband's craft. In artisan households, those of bakers, weavers, cobblers, smiths, women participated in the production process, whether spinning thread, preparing leather, or selling finished goods. Some guilds acknowledged this reality, admitting wives or widows into membership, though usually as exceptions. More often, women's work was invisible, absorbed into the legal authority of husbands, yet their contribution was not marginal. Without it, many small workshops could not have survived. Widows occupied a distinctive place in the urban economy. The death of a husband might leave a woman in precarious circumstances, but it could also open a space for unexpected autonomy. Many widows continued their husband's trade, employing apprentices, running workshops, and appearing in guild records. Some became respected businesswomen, their authority drawn from necessity, but exercised with competence. Still, this independence was fragile. A widow's rights often lasted only until she remarried, at which point her legal identity was absorbed into her new husband's. Even in freedom, the structures of patriarchy pressed closely, reminding her that her position was provisional, not entirely her own. For poorer women, survival was far harsher. Domestic service was one of the most common occupations, drawing young girls from countryside into cities where they worked in kitchens, laundries, and wealthy households. Their labor was heavy, their pay low, and their vulnerability high. Service offered food and lodging, but it also exposed women to exploitation, their futures dependent on the goodwill of employers. Others worked as laundresses, water carriers, or street cleaners, jobs at the very edge of urban necessity, poorly paid and quickly forgotten. For many, these roles were stepping stones toward marriage, though not always upward ones, for poverty followed women into wedlock as surely as into service. The crowded streets of medieval towns also fostered suspicion. Women who lived without husbands, widows, spinsters, or those estranged, were often viewed uneasily. The line between a woman who sold bread and a woman who sold her body was not always clearly drawn in the eyes of neighbors, and moralists were quick to associate female independence with immorality. Prostitution itself existed openly in cities, sometimes even regulated by authorities, and many of those who turned to it did so from poverty rather than choice. Brothels and red light districts were fixtures of urban landscapes, their existence tolerated as a necessary evil, while the women within them lived lives marked by stigma, danger, and invisibility. In crowded neighborhoods, women also bore responsibility for maintaining households under conditions of constant strain. Fires, plagues, and shortages swept through cities with regularity, and it was women who scrambled to feed children, nurse the sick, or salvage possessions. Their resilience was often the first line of defense against urban calamity. Chroniclers rarely described this labor, for it was not dramatic, but without it the city could not function. The invisible work of keeping families alive amid dirt, noise, and danger formed the fabric of urban survival. Some women rose above the margins, carving places of prestige within the city. Wealthy merchant wives might oversee estates, negotiate contracts, or commission chapels and charitable works. Certain cities recorded female benefactors who funded hospitals, almshouses, or churches, their names preserved in stone inscriptions even when chronicles passed them over. In rare cases, urban women became prominent leaders of guilds or confraternities, commanding respect within their communities. These examples, though exceptional, remind us that the city was not wholly closed to female ambition. It simply allowed it only at the edges, or under circumstances where male structures benefited. The perception of women in cities, as in so many aspects of medieval life, was shaped by ambivalence. They were indispensable to the markets, households, and workshops that made urban life possible, yet they were seldom celebrated. Their economic presence was tolerated, but their independence was suspect. Their labor was constant, but their recognition was minimal. In the eyes of clerics and moralists, the city itself was a place of temptation and corruption, and women, whether selling bread, brewing ale, or walking unaccompanied through streets, were often portrayed as its symbols of danger. And yet, beneath the suspicion and invisibility, women carried on. They rose before dawn to prepare bread, they bargained in marketplaces, they carried jugs of ale to thirsty workers, they kept households afloat through fires and famines. Their lives were not glamorous, but they were essential. When we picture a medieval city, we often imagine stone walls, guild halls, and bustling squares, but the true sound of the city was the murmur of countless women, balancing survival in a world that offered them little recognition but demanded their unending labor. In the stone shadows of medieval towns, and along the muddy lanes of rural villages, poverty was not an exception, but a constant presence. For many, life balanced precariously between enough to eat and nothing at all, between shelter under a roof and nights beneath the open sky. And within this wide landscape of struggle, women bore burdens with particular severity. A man who lost his work might find day labor or join a lord's retinue in hopes of wages. But a woman, especially one without family protection, faced a narrower set of choices and harsher judgments. Beggars, widows, and abandoned wives made up a hidden multitude, their lives recorded only in fragments, an entry in a parish register, a fine in a city record, a passing mention in a moralist's sermon. History seldom lingered on them, but they were always there, pressing at the margins of survival. The widow was perhaps the most common figure of female poverty. Death was never far in the Middle Ages, and a woman's security was often tied directly to her husband's presence. When he died, she might inherit some portion of property or tools, but more often she inherited only debts, children, and the fragile goodwill of neighbors. Some widows managed to keep small workshops or stalls alive, eking out survival with the help of older sons. Others fell quickly into destitution, especially if no kin supported them. A widow too young to command respect and too poor to attract remarriage risked sliding into visible poverty, her veil marking not only her grief but her vulnerability. Abandoned wives endured a different kind of hardship. Men who traveled for trade or war sometimes never returned, leaving their families to fend for themselves. The church condemned desertion, but condemnation did not feed hungry mouths. A woman left behind could not easily remarry without proof of death, and so she remained in a limbo, neither wife with support, nor widow with recognized rights. Parish relief might provide occasional bread, neighbors might share scraps, but more often she had to beg, her children beside her, their need a visible reminder of her husband's absence. The beggar woman was a familiar sight in both countryside and town, cloaked in rags, perhaps carrying an infant or guiding a half-starved child. She occupied thresholds outside church doors, at market edges, near taverns where travelers passed. Her presence was tolerated, but never celebrated. Almsgiving was considered a Christian duty, and the poor were sometimes praised as the treasury of the church, for to give to them was to give to Christ. Yet the same moralists who urged charity also warned of fraud, of women who begged dishonestly, who feigned suffering or used their children to stir pity. Thus the beggar was both a symbol of holiness and a source of suspicion. Women's poverty carried sharper risks than men's, for hunger could drive them toward choices that society condemned but necessity demanded. Some turned to prostitution, tolerated in cities yet stigmatized by preachers and neighbors alike. Others entered service in the most menial forms, scrubbing floors or carrying water for pennies that barely sustained them. A few sought the protection of convents, where nuns might admit them as lay sisters or offer food at the gates, but convent charity was limited and selective. Many more remained outside, enduring the scorn of those who crossed themselves when they passed, muttering prayers against contagion, both physical and moral. Urban records sometimes list women fined for begging without permission, their names briefly preserved in ink. These entries remind us that poverty itself was policed, not only endured. Cities regulated beggars, assigning them to parishes or requiring licenses, and those who begged beyond their assigned place could be punished. Women thus faced not only hunger, but the risk of legal penalties, as if their very survival was a nuisance to civic order. In some towns, guilds or brotherhoods provided limited aid, but these were small islands in an ocean of want. The countryside offered its own bleakness. A poor woman in a village might glean leftover grain after harvest, a practice tolerated as necessity, but often resented by landowners. She might gather firewood from hedgerows, carry water from distant wells, or spin thread for meager pay. If she fell ill, her chances of recovery were slim, for no healer came to those who had no coin. Children often bore the signs of this poverty: thin faces, stunted growth, bare feet even in frost. Yet the mother carried on, her resilience the only shield against complete collapse. The spiritual language of the time painted poverty in paradoxical tones. On one hand, preachers extolled the poor as closer to Christ, their suffering an imitation of his humility. On the other hand, the poor were scolded as lazy, sinful, or dangerous. Women bore the brunt of this contradiction. They were praised as embodiments of piety if they endured silently, but condemned as immoral if they sought survival through means that defied ideals. A man's poverty could be framed as bad fortune, a woman's was often framed as moral failing. And yet, women in poverty formed quiet networks of mutual aid. A widow might take in the child of a neighbor who worked long hours. A group of poor women might share the cost of a candle for evening work. They loaned one another scraps of food, cared for one another's sick, and mourned together when children were lost. These bonds did not erase their hardship, but they softened it, creating solidarity in lives where institutions offered little. The voices of these women seldom reached parchment. Their prayers whispered at roadside shrines, their songs hummed to restless infants, their complaints muttered in hunger. These left no trace in chronicles, yet their absence from record should not deceive us into imagining their absence from life. They filled the streets, markets and alleys, their presence both ubiquitous and invisible. They were the shadows against which medieval society defined itself, tolerated because they reminded the wealthy of their duty to give, yet never granted dignity in their own right. To walk through a medieval city in the early dawn would be to see them, women sweeping doorways in return for scraps, women crouched against walls with hands outstretched, women carrying baskets of stale bread gleaned from kitchens. Their poverty was not a spectacle but a constant background too familiar to draw notice. It is only when we pause to imagine their endurance that we sense how much of medieval life depended not on kings or knights, but on countless women who bore suffering in silence, their names forgotten, yet their lives woven into the fabric of survival. The medieval world was often imagined as rooted, a place of fixed villages, familiar parishes, and people who seldom strayed far from the soil that fed them. And yet, beneath this perception of immobility, movement was constant. Merchants carrying wares across frontiers, soldiers marching in retinues, peasants drawn to new lands by promise or necessity. Among these travelers, though seldom named, were women walking roads, boarding ships, climbing mountain passes, and crossing rivers. Their journeys were not always voluntary, nor were they often celebrated, but they formed an essential, if muted, current of medieval life. The most recognized avenue of female travel came through pilgrimage. The Christian imagination of the Middle Ages brimmed with shrines and holy sites. Canterbury, Santiago de Compostela, Rome, Jerusalem. Pilgrimage was both penance and devotion, a way of seeking healing, forgiveness, or spiritual merit. Women joined these flows, some alone, others in groups, often with kin or fellow parishioners. A sick child might prompt a mother to walk miles to the shrine of a local saint, seeking miraculous cure. A widow might travel with a band of pilgrims as protection against the dangers of the road. A noblewoman might sponsor an elaborate journey, leaving records in charters or donations at shrines. Yet even here, women's presence was filtered through suspicion. Clerical writers worried about female pilgrims, fearing that travel exposed them to temptation or impropriety. Sermons warned against women wandering without guardians, their mobility seen as dangerous to both body and soul. And yet the evidence of tokens, badges and relics found in women's graves suggests that many did travel, leaving home for sacred destinations and carrying back small mementos of their devotion. Beyond pilgrimage lay other, harsher journeys. Migration was a reality of medieval life, often forced by famine, war, or plague. When crops failed, entire families might uproot, women trudging beside carts piled with belongings, children clinging to their skirts. During wars, women fled burning villages, carrying infants or guiding the elderly. These journeys rarely entered chronicles except as part of larger narratives of disaster. Yet for those who endured them, the memory was written in hunger, exhaustion, and the relentless tread of miles beneath weary feet. Marriage too could set women upon roads. A daughter sent to wed in another town or region travelled with dowry chests, attendants, and the weight of leaving home. Noble marriages sometimes spanned kingdoms, carrying women across mountains and seas to courts where they were strangers in language and custom. Chronicles might note the political significance of such unions, but the lived experience of the bride, her departure, her fear, her adjustments was left unspoken. Peasant women too sometimes left their natal villages for marriage, shifting allegiance to a new parish, where they carved fresh identities as wives and mothers. Some women's travel was tied to trade. In cities, wives of merchants or artisans occasionally accompanied goods to markets, selling directly to customers or ensuring safe transactions. Alewives carried their barrels across town, laundresses hauled linens to riversides, water sellers toted heavy buckets through winding streets. These were short journeys, repeated endlessly, yet they formed the daily pulse of movement in towns, and though small in scope, they reveal how mobility was part of survival, not adventure. For women of the margins, travel could mean exile. Accused criminals, suspected witches, or women whose reputations were destroyed might be forced to leave their homes. Banishment was a punishment imposed by both civic and ecclesiastical courts, and women expelled from their communities walked uncertain roads with no guarantee of shelter. Their journeys are the least recorded, their fates largely lost, but they remind us that travel was not always chosen. There were, too, women who ventured into extraordinary paths. Pilgrim accounts mention women who reached Jerusalem, enduring the same seas and deserts as men. The Crusades brought noble women into long marches, sometimes accompanying armies, sometimes establishing hospitals or households along the way. Traders' wives traveled to fairs in Champagne, Flanders, or beyond. Though exceptional, such women left faint imprints in chronicles or charters, reminders that female mobility extended further than suspicion might suggest. The risks of travel weighed heavily. Roads were rough, bridges precarious, forests haunted by thieves. Women traveling alone were particularly vulnerable, which is why many sought company, traveling with family, fellow villagers, or organized groups. Pilgrim bands provided a semblance of safety, though not always protection. Illness was a constant danger, as food and water along the way could bring disease. Weather punished relentlessly, with rain soaking clothing and cold winds cutting across exposed paths. And yet, despite these hardships, women walked, rode, their journeys stitched into the broader patterns of medieval life. Spiritual writers sometimes used women's travel as metaphor, depicting the soul as a pilgrim crossing dangerous terrain. In this imagery, female pilgrims became symbols of humility, faith, and dependence on divine guidance. But the real women who walked those paths were less symbolic than practical. They carried bread, blankets, and children. They negotiated inns, strangers, and toll collectors. Their journeys were not parables but lived endurance, undertaken for reasons as varied as devotion, necessity, or survival. When we try to imagine the soundscape of a medieval road, we must hear women among the footsteps, the murmur of mothers soothing restless children, the calls of wives bargaining at roadside stalls, the silence of widows walking with bowed heads. They were not the chroniclers of their age, but they were always present, leaving faint traces on the stones and dust of Europe's paths. The records are thin, yet archaeology gives hints. Pilgrim badges found in women's graves, tokens from shrines clasped in skeletal hands, the remains of shoes worn thin by walking. These fragments remind us that even in a world that sought to tether women to hearth and household, movement was inevitable. The long roads carried them, silently, persistently, shaping their lives even as the records overlooked them. Thus, women in the Middle Ages were not entirely stationary. They journeyed to holy shrines, fled from danger, migrated with families, followed husbands into new lives, and sometimes ventured alone in acts of piety or necessity. Their travel was seldom celebrated, rarely recorded, and often shadowed by suspicion. Yet the presence of women on medieval roads was real, woven into the fabric of Europe's restless movement, a quiet testimony to endurance, faith, and survival. Death was a constant companion in the Middle Ages, a shadow that lingered in every village, every town, and every household. Life was fragile, easily undone by famine, plague, childbirth, or war, and women bore a particular closeness to mortality. They were givers of life, yet often died while giving it. They prepared bodies for burial, yet their own bodies were subject to rituals and silences shaped by gender and faith. The death of a woman was not always remembered in chronicles, but it left traces in the prayers whispered by her kin, the funeral rites performed at her grave, and the faint inscriptions etched onto fading stones. In the Christian imagination of the Middle Ages, death was not an end but a passage. The soul departed the fragile flesh, moving toward judgment, purgation, or paradise. For women as for men, this journey was accompanied by rituals meant to ease the soul's passage, candles placed near the dying bed, priests summoned to administer the last rites, family members gathering in vigil. Yet there were differences in how death was framed depending on gender. Male deaths, especially among nobles and clerics, were often chronicled, marked with eulogies and memorials. Women's deaths, by contrast, were more likely to fade into the fabric of family memory, noted only if they were wives, mothers, or patrons of religious houses. Burial customs reflected these distinctions. Noble women might be interred in abbeys, their effigies carved in stone, their names inscribed in necrologies that monks recited during annual commemorations. Queens, saints, and benefactresses left behind visible tombs, some richly adorned with imagery of piety and virtue. Yet the majority of women, peasants, artisans, servants, were buried without marker in simple churchyards, their identities soon lost as graves were reused, wooden crosses decayed, or memory faded. Death equalized in theory, but in practice it reinforced hierarchies of class and gender. The prayers said for female souls also reveal subtle distinctions. In liturgical texts, prayers often referred to women as servants of God, or handmaids of Christ, placing them in a posture of humility. Monastic necrologies might list a noble woman who had endowed land or wealth, ensuring her soul was remembered through the chanting of masses. Poorer women relied on the prayers of kin, the murmured rosaries of children, or the alms given in their name. Memory after death was thus tied, not only to piety but to social position, shaping whether a woman's soul lingered in collective memory, or passed into silence. The role of women as mourners was also significant. When death struck a household, it was often women who washed and prepared the body, dressed it in burial garments, and organized the vigil. Laments, sometimes performed as ritualized weeping or keening, were often the voices of women, expressing grief that both honored the dead and gave release to the living. These practices linked women to the cycle of death, not only as the departed, but as the custodians of memory. Their labor in mourning was both necessary and undervalued. Another example of presence hidden in silence. Childbirth, that most dangerous threshold, was a site where life and death met most starkly for women. Many died in labor, their bodies interred with infants who had not survived, both bound together in the same grave. Priests and midwives held prayers ready for the dying mother, beseeching God's mercy on a soul cut short. Chronicles seldom noted such deaths, for they were common and ordinary, yet in each village the loss left deep scars in families and communities. Women's mortality in childbirth shaped medieval demographics, shortened life expectancy, and left many households fractured. The memory of women after death was also shaped by suspicion and superstition. Some were remembered as saints, their lives turned into examples of virtue, their bones relics for devotion. Others, however, were feared after death, associated with witchcraft or restless spirits. Folk belief sometimes imagined women who died in childbirth, or without proper rites, as dangerous presences, wandering between worlds. This duality, saint or spectre, shows how medieval culture shaped the memory of women through the lens of male imagination, leaving little room for the complex humanity of ordinary female lives. Widows occupied a unique space between life and death. Having survived husbands, they were often associated with mourning for long years, clad in black or in simple garb. Their lives became testimonies to the deaths they had witnessed. Some turned toward pious endowments, giving to monasteries in exchange for prayers for their own souls. Others drifted into poverty, their husband's death erasing their stability, leaving them to beg or rely on charity. Death thus shaped women's fates not only when it claimed them, but when it claimed those around them. Grave goods offer further glimpses into women's deaths. While Christian custom discouraged lavish burial, archaeological finds sometimes reveal rosaries, pilgrim badges, or small tokens placed with female bodies. These objects, humble though they were, speak of the personal piety and networks of devotion that surrounded women in death. They remind us that even when names were not written down, lives were still honored in quiet, intimate ways. Perhaps most striking is how easily women's deaths were erased from written history. Chronicles were filled with kings, bishops, battles and treaties, where women's passing was mentioned only if it altered dynasties or patronage. Parish records, where they existed, sometimes listed names, but often without detail beyond wife of or daughter of. Women were remembered relationally, not individually, their identities tethered to male kin, and when graves were unmarked, even that tether vanished, leaving silence where once there had been a life. Yet silence is not absence. The very repetition of prayers for the dead in churches and convents, whispered daily by monks and nuns, carried countless unnamed female souls into the liturgical rhythm of memory. Every toll of a funeral bell, every candle lit for the departed, every fragment of a necrology that reads for our sisters departed, keeps alive a faint echo of medieval women's presence in death. Though their voices are missing, Their traces endure in ritual, in custom, and in the grief of those left behind. To speak of women and death in the Middle Ages is thus to recognize both presence and erasure. They were ever near to mortality, their lives marked by it, their bodies subject to rituals both tender and dismissive. Some became saints, others forgotten graves, but all were part of the cycle of prayer, burial, and remembrance that structured medieval existence. In death, as in life, women were essential, though their stories were seldom told. To speak of medieval women is often to encounter silence. Their names are missing from chronicles, their voices absent from the official records that shaped memory, their stories filtered through the pens of men who decided what was worth remembering. And yet, to walk carefully through the remnants of the Middle Ages is to find that women were never entirely gone. Though forgotten in written history, they are not absent in the world they shaped. Their presence lingers in textiles, manuscripts, buildings, and objects that carry the faint but undeniable marks of their labor, devotion, and creativity. Cloth, above all, bears witness to women's hands. Spinning, weaving, dyeing, sewing, these were daily acts repeated endlessly, so common that they seemed unworthy of record. Yet the survival of medieval textiles tells another story. Every thread spun into linen for an altar cloth, every carefully embroidered design on a cope, every durable weave in a merchant's tunic points to women's skill. The Bayeux tapestry, stitched in the 11th century, is perhaps the most famous surviving example, a monumental work of embroidery, narrating conquest and kings. Scholars still debate whether noble women or professional seamstresses crafted it, but either way, the tapestry demonstrates how women's artistry could shape historical memory in threads where their names did not survive. Countless smaller works, from household linens to garments for children, carried similar traces. Though unsigned, these pieces are enduring legacies of women's daily lives. Manuscripts, too, hold subtle evidence of female presence. While male monks dominated scriptoria, some convents maintained workshops where nuns copied texts, illuminated initials, or bound volumes. Marginalia, small doodles, flowers, or devotional notes sometimes betray feminine touch, even if unsigned. Women also commissioned manuscripts. Their wealth turned into books of hours filled with prayers they recited. These books, treasured possessions often passed from mother to daughter, carry women's fingerprints in smudged corners, worn pages, and personal annotations. Though the chroniclers did not write their lives, their devotional reading shaped the rhythm of private piety, binding women to texts in ways both intimate and enduring. Objects of devotion, too, whisper women's presence. Pilgrim badges found in graves of women tell of journeys made to holy sites. Rosary beads worn smooth by fingers, small reliquaries clasped in death, tokens of saints carried in pouches, all bear the imprint of women's faith. Household shrines sometimes contain statues dressed with textiles made by wives or daughters, clothing the sacred with domestic craft. Each object may seem anonymous, yet together they reveal a culture where women's piety was woven into the material world, even when their names slipped from record. Architecture carries similar traces. Convents, almshouses and chapels endowed by widows or noble women still stand across Europe. Their stones do not always bear inscriptions of their female patrons, but archives occasionally reveal their foundations. These buildings, spaces of prayer and charity, shaped communities long after the women who sponsored them were gone. In smaller ways too, women's labor was part of construction, carrying water for mortar, preparing food for masons, weaving cloth for workers. The physical world of medieval towns and villages thus contains hidden contributions, silent but enduring. Even the most ordinary objects tell stories. Ceramic fragments found in kitchens, spindle whorls buried in fields, thimbles lost in floorboards, archaeologists uncover them, piecing together the texture of women's work. A worn wooden spoon, smoothed by years of stirring porridge, once lay in a woman's hand. A child's leather shoe, mended with careful stitches, testifies to a mother's quiet attention. These are not monuments of power, but they are remnants of lives lived. the material legacy of forgotten women who shaped families and households through labor, too ordinary for records, yet indispensable for survival. Food culture, too, was carried by women's hands. Recipes passed orally, brewing traditions guarded in kitchens, herbal remedies mixed for children, all vanished from written record, but persisted in practice. Even when condemned as superstition, such knowledge was materialized in the preparation of meals, medicines, and drinks. All wooden bowls, cauldrons, and pots, excavated centuries later, carry residue of this work, faint echoes of voices that explained ingredients, measured portions, or soothed with remedies. Here women's knowledge survived not in parchment but in memory, passed hand to hand, embodied in daily use. Silence in Chronicles does not erase presence. Rather, it redirects us to different archives. The archive of objects, fibers, bones, and buildings. Women may be absent from the texts, but they remain in the material culture that shaped daily medieval life. Each fragment is a reminder that history's silence is not emptiness, but a distortion that privileges some voices over others. The forgotten women of the Middle Ages are still here, in the things they made, touched, used, and left behind. And perhaps this is the final paradox. Women were both forgotten and remembered, silenced yet present, absent from texts yet woven into the very fabric of medieval existence. The silence we encounter is not theirs, but the silence imposed upon them by structures of record-keeping, by chroniclers who chose kings and battles over households and hearths. To recover women's lives, we must learn to listen differently, to hear in the hum of the spindle, in the thread of embroidery, in the worn page of a prayer book, in the faint outlines of a footprint pressed into medieval dust. Thus, the story of medieval women ends not with absence but with endurance. They remain, not in the loud proclamations of chronicles, but in the quiet persistence of material traces. Forgotten in words, but not in the world, their presence lingers, silent yet unyielding, waiting for those who pause, look closely, and listen. History, as it has come down to us, is not the sum of all that happened, but only the sum of what was written, and even then only what survived the centuries of neglect, fire, and forgetfulness. In this selective archive, women appear rarely, and when they do, it is often through the eyes of men who framed their lives according to their own purposes. But absence in parchment does not mean absence in reality, and in the quiet decades of modern scholarship, historians have slowly, carefully, pieced together fragments to restore something of the lives of those women who once seemed lost in silence. This act of remembrance, fragile and incomplete though it is, ensures that the forgotten women of the Middle Ages are not erased a second time. The process begins with fragments. A spindle whorl dug from the soil of a long-abandoned village tells of labor at a hearth. A worn rosary tucked beside bones in a grave whispers of prayers once murmured in darkened chapels. A single letter, written by a woman to a distant relative, reveals affection, fear, or complaint, pulling her voice across centuries. These fragments, scattered and ordinary, may appear slight, yet when gathered patiently they build mosaics of life. It is not the grand chronicles that allow us to hear these women, but the quiet, overlooked pieces of evidence that most closely cling to the fabric of their daily existence. Historians of women's lives must read sources differently. When a charter lists a woman only as wife of, or daughter of, the task is to ask what that phrasing hides, what it reveals about kinship, dependence, or resilience. When a moralist sermon rails against women's travel, one must hear in that anxiety the reality that women did indeed move, walk roads, and make pilgrimages. When a law codes a woman's guardianship under husband or father, one must seek the rare exceptions where women resisted, negotiated, or carved space for autonomy. To write women back into history is not to invent them, but to learn to listen between the lines, to detect the presence that male authors tried, sometimes unsuccessfully, to silence. Archaeology has become one of the richest allies in this recovery. Excavations of medieval towns uncover workshops, kitchens, and marketplaces, places where women's labor unfolded beyond the gaze of chroniclers. The discovery of spindle whorls, looms, needles, pots, and combs turns the soil into a record more democratic than parchment. In cemeteries, the careful study of skeletons tracing childbirth scars in pelvic bones, signs of malnutrition in teeth, or arthritis from long years of labor, allows scholars to reconstruct not just lives but hardships. The body itself becomes an archive, silently recording the burdens of work, the risks of birth, the wear of survival. Texts, too, are reread with new eyes. Where once chronicles were taken at face value, now they are scrutinized for what they omit, what they downplay, and what they inadvertently reveal. Marginal notes in prayer books, names scribbled in manorial rolls, signatures on wills, all are searched for traces of female presence. Even silence itself is examined. Why, for example, certain women are absent from records where men of equal standing are named, or why accusations of witchcraft grew precisely in moments when women's healing roles threatened clerical authority. In these gaps and tensions, historians reconstruct the outlines of women's lives once dismissed as irrelevant. There is also the work of comparative study, placing scattered cases side by side, a letter from an abbess in Germany, a recipe preserved in an English household, a set of burial practices from Italy. All may seem isolated, but together they reveal patterns of devotion, skill, or survival common across regions. By weaving together these small threads, scholars build a tapestry not unlike those made by the women themselves, detailed, textured, and resilient. This recovery of women's lives is not without difficulty. Sources remain partial, interpretation is always uncertain, and the temptation to romanticize can be strong. Yet the work continues, because silence in history is not neutral. It is a form of erasure, and erasure must be resisted. To remember medieval women is to honor the reality that half of humanity lived, labored, and loved in those centuries, even if their stories were not written in ink. By piecing together their presence, historians allow them to emerge, faintly but unmistakably, from the shadows. And in this act of remembrance, there is more at stake than historical curiosity. The stories of medieval women remind us of the fragility of memory, the way entire lives can vanish when record keepers deem them unworthy. They challenge us to ask whose voices are still silenced today, whose stories are overlooked, and how future historians will judge our own archives. To restore medieval women to memory is not only to honor them, but to practice vigilance against silence itself. For in the end, women of the Middle Ages were never truly absent. They spun the thread, wove the cloth, bore the children, tilled the soil, healed the sick, mourned the dead, prayed at the shrines, and carried the burdens of survival. They built the world, even if chronicles forgot to say so. Their traces remain in objects, in bones, in whispers between the lines, waiting for those who care enough to look closely. Modern historians, archaeologists, and readers take up this work not as an act of charity, but as an act of justice, to acknowledge presence where history long claimed there was none. Thus, we return to the paradox that has shaped our long journey. Medieval women were forgotten, but never absent. They were silenced, but not destroyed. Their lives can be pieced together, patiently, fragment by fragment, until they are once again visible, not in the loud proclamations of kings and battles, but in the quiet endurance of daily life. And in remembering them, we do not only honor the past, we also resist the silence that so easily swallows lives, ensuring that those once left unrecorded are not erased again.